Well, hello. My name is Brian Bowen, and welcome to my channel, Apologetics 101. Today, we're going to take just a tiny bit break from the Genesis series. Not a big one, just kind of a single video that I'm doing on another topic matter. Well, actually, it's all on the Genesis issue. It's related to it, but it's a response video. It's something I decided to do. I know YouTube videos certain types of React videos are becoming popular, and simply React on YouTube is just simply a fancy way of saying, this is my response to what I'm hearing say. I thought about doing like an apologist reacts, a Bible scholar reacts. Today it's going to be a Bible scholar reacts because I actually specialize in biblical studies, even at the academic level, to a point where I've got relative degrees and things, or a degree in that area, in religious studies, and its central focus is on biblical studies and that sort of thing. And we're here right now doing a response video, essentially to a video to a girl named her name is Erika, but her channel is Gutsick Gibbon, and we're going to be responding to a video where she actually interviewed Bart Ehrman. And as you probably know, I've actually I've actually responded to Bart Ehrman multiple times on my channel. If you're familiar with some of my earlier stuff, I personally responded to Bart Ehrman a number of things. I got a series out called the Bart Ehrman series, where I responded to several prize arguments that he makes. A few of those, or at least one of them, is something he's made here. I responded on some of the things he says on alleged Bible contradictions. I have a video where I responded to his what he said or some of the things he said in his debate with Mike Kona on the 7-hour debate that they did. On the subject matter of the resurrection, and I responded to that. And she has him on here interviewing. I think the video is like over a year old, which is it's a little bit odd because I watched a video that she did not too long ago where she started really hammering the idea that Dr. Jason Lau is responding to an issue that's outside of his normal area of expertise and things of that nature. And here she is outside of her area of expertise talking to another guy who's also outside of this area of expertise. When it deals with Genesis, you're dealing with Old Testament studies, you're dealing with Hebrew, you're dealing with Semitic studies, you're dealing with biblical studies, you're dealing with stuff like that. But Bart Ehrman is a New Testament scholar. He's a skeptic. Some days he says he's an atheist, some days he says he's an agnostic. It depends on which book you read, which Bart you just happen to get, and how he feels just that one day. He switches back and forth. But sometimes he says he's an atheist, sometimes he says he's an agnostic. In any given case, he's a Bible skeptic, a very popular Bible skeptic, and he usually writes on the New Testament. His only academic training is actually in textual criticism. And that's his only action, and it's New Testament textual criticism. It's not Old Testament textual criticism. I don't know if he knows that much about Old Testament textual criticism. He probably doesn't know as much, know more than what I would know about the Old Testament textual criticism. I know some things about it, but I don't know I don't know as much about Old Testament textual criticism as I do about New Testament textual criticism. And the same thing with Bart. I think he probably is more familiar with New Testament textual criticism anyhow. But his academic degree is in textual criticism of the New Testament, although he has said, some time back, a while back, that he's moved past that, and now he claims to be a historian. Now, he's a historian by definition. We'll get to that in a little bit, because he'll say that. But he's a historian by definition, but he is not a professional historian. He don't have any degrees in that area at all, so he's not trained at the academic level in historiography. I plan on being trained in that someday. So he's not a professional historian. He can never teach in that field. He does write books in that field, though, but not anything peer reviewed. But he does write books in that area. but he's not a professional historian in that sense. Whether he's more a historian by definition, but not necessarily by trade, not professionally. He has no academic training in that area. But in any given case, he makes, of course, he's not trained in biblical studies at all. He's not an Old Testament scholar at all. I think Erika will gloss over this by calling him a Bible scholar, in order to make it seem like he's supposed to have all kinds of expertise on the Bible in general. But in reality, his main area of expertise is the New Testament. He has a lecture series or something like that he's doing or has done on Genesis, and so that's probably why Erika's brought him in. But he's no expert on Genesis. He shouldn't even be talking about it. I doubt if he would ever face challenge for a lot of the stuff that he was saying in this discussion. I doubt if you'll ever get challenge, if you'll ever actually face off against someone challenging him in a debate, because he hasn't debated, at least so far, he has not debated the subject matter of the book of Genesis. Instead, he's debated other things. He's debated other stuff, and he hasn't written on the subject matter either. He just has I guess, some kind of lecture series. I don't know. He's doing something on Genesis. But in any given case, he's not an expert at this at all, and he should. And he makes like her. He makes tons of mistakes, and there's some things he says that I'm thinking he should know better than say that. But he seems to say it in a very deceptive sort of manner, make you think that it's this way, when in reality he should know that it's not that way. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But in any given case, without furthermore, let's dive into this.
And every now and again, we will dip our little non-opposable toe into the waters of biblical academia.
By the way, just in case you don't know, Erika is an evolutionist, and she does a lot of videos on evolution, and she's especially, most of her videos are against young Earth creationists. So that's what most of her videos are targeting, in either young Earth creationist or anything relating to evolution. That's primarily what she dedicates herself to. All right, let's continue.
And why
he says he wants to. Oh, she says she wants to engage in biblical academia, and she has no knowledge in this area. I don't know if she realizes this is an actual field of study. This is not just some fancy hobby that we're interested in, and I'm interested in talking about what you're thinking about the Bible, even though I don't agree with it. I'm gonna jump into this. No, this is not a fancy hobby. This is actually a field of study. It's an actual area of expertise. And there are people that specializes in this thing. And Bart is not one of them, and neither are you.
Although young Earth creationism is of course absurd from a scientific standpoint, it's also really kind of bonkers.
Yeah, it's not absurd from a scientific standpoint. We have actual PhD scientists that favor our position, that come up with actual real models. We even appear in peer review. We got peer review literature, peer review journals, and things like that. Answers Research Journal. I heard, I think ICR has one. I forgot what it's called, but it's an actual research journal as well. It's a peer review journal. But yeah, we even, and so occasionally young Earth creationists even appear in secular journals. It doesn't happen very often because there's worldview issues and so forth, but they do actually appear in seculars every now and then, if they manage to get their stuff in there. But in any given case, yeah, it's not absurd from a scientific standpoint. This is just her being. I'm sure this is what she thinks, but it's false.
From a biblical interpretation standpoint. Now,
okay, keep in mind, she wants to approach this from a biblical interpretation standpoint. They're going to make a lot of mistakes in biblical studies. And and this has just happened to me, my speciality, even at the academic level. area of expertise at the academic level is biblical studies. So let's see what we can do with this.
I am, of course, not a biblical scholar, but
yeah, we got that part.
Today I'm going to present to you a lovely conversation that I had the opportunity to have with someone who is a biblical scholar.
Okay, notice what she just did. She basically used the generic understanding of a Bible scholar. Try to understand there is actually different areas of fields of study within Scripture, that we actually do pertaining to Scripture. Bart Ehrman is what's called a New Testament scholar. A New Testament scholar is someone whose central focus is on the New Testament, the background of the New Testament, the text of the New Testament, the history of the New Testament, and New Testament in general. And of course, there are, they might have different nuances in those in that way, but Old Testament, because it's a different situation, you got a different group of people, you got a different language, you got a different setting, different time, over the course of a certain amount of time that these books are being written in, and so forth. It takes a different amount of study. That doesn't mean that it would not be the same rules of exegesis. The rules of exegesis will be the same in the Old and New Testament. But even when it comes to exegesis and hermeneutics, that all falls under biblical studies. Now, you might be able to get away, as far as information on the Old Testament, like Book of Genesis, for example. If you're an Old Testament scholar, if you're a Hebrew scholar, if you're even a Semitic scholar, maybe you can get away with that, even without being specifically specializing in biblical studies. Because those will focus the biblical study courses. You will have biblical study courses as a result if you're in those fields. Bart Ehrman is not one of them. Simply throwing up a generic title and saying, oh, well, he's a Bible scholar in Old Testament doesn't make him an Old Testament scholar. And it certainly doesn't make him a specialist in biblical studies. Okay? It doesn't make him that. All right? She's throwing up that term to make it look like, oh, I'm not like this. I'm not a Bible scholar, but here's one who is. And yet, Bart Ehrman's speciality in terms of his area of expertise is not in the Old Testament. It's not in the history of the Old Testament. It's not in exegesis. It's not in biblical studies. So he is not a specialist that should be talking about and knowing what he's talking about concerning the Old Testament, the history of the Old Testament, the language of the Old Testament, the peoples of the Old Testament, the facts concerning the Old Testament, the text of the Old Testament, because Old Testament study is a different study from New Testament textual criticism, and he's not a specialist in that. He's not a specialist in biblical studies, so he shouldn't have no say on exegesis, interpretation, hermeneutics, etc. And he makes a lot of mistakes as a result. And so, but she's trying to make you think that he does. He should know what he's talking about. No. He's obviously outside of his field of study right now.
And that is the world-renowned scholar and academic, Dr.
That really has nothing to do with it. Yes, he's famous across the world. And I suppose you write secular literature. There's young Earth creationists that are famous all over the world. Right now, I'm producing a YouTube video, and my YouTube video is going viral all over the world. That really doesn't mean anything. That just means you're famous. That's all that means.
Bart Ehrman. Dr. Ehrman is a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he has edited or written over 33 books. That's like half of the number of books in the Bible, by the way.
Wow. He wrote 33 books, so therefore that's half the... I mean, there's some people that write more books than what we have in the Bible. That doesn't mean anything. I don't know. She just thought that was interesting. I don't know.
He has also added a couple of New York bestsellers in there, 6 of them to be precise. You got Misquoting Jesus, you got How Jesus Became God, and Forged, among others.
Yeah, I got those books. I meant to have them out because I have them on the shelf. I've got all 3 of those books. I actually buy Bart Ehrman's books, not because I agree with them. I don't agree with them. I buy it because I'm an apologist. I have an apologetic YouTube channel, and I respond to them. So I bought his books before. Plus, I engage in textual criticism, so I bought his book on misquoting Jesus, which he did many times. Any given case. The fact that there are bestsellers, again, young Earth creationists have popular best-selling books out right now. But that doesn't really have anything to do with, right or wrong. I think she's just trying to spice up the introduction there to make him look like, oh, he's something else. He's got a few books that have been, bestsellers. He's written so many books, or written or edited, or co-authored, and that sort of thing. It's just intended to. I think she's just intended to just spice up the interview. But unfortunately, this has nothing to do with his credibility or whether he's right or wrong, because we have people on our side that did that too.
As you guys also probably know, I would consider myself a good scholarship and methodology enjoyer, and Dr. Ehrman really exemplifies this in his field.
Bart Ehrman's methodology in his books, we're probably not going to get much into this, maybe a little bit, but his methodology is very inconsistent, and this has been noted by other scholars, even skeptical scholars have noted this. In one book, he would talk about, he doesn't think you can know anything about what the original text says. In the next book, he, tell you what the original text said. So he doesn't have a very consistent methodology. He's a very inconsistent scholar. This has been well documented, well knowledged, even by other skeptics who Bart would probably consider his colleagues, and they'll say the same thing. He's very inconsistent when it comes to his methodology. His methodology isn't sound. He claims to have a historical methodology, the method that most historians use, but it turns out that his method is really more centered around critical historians and critical scholars' methods rather than the methods of actual professional historians. Most professional historians would not agree with how he approaches subjects like the New Testament and things like that. He claims it represents mainstream historical method, and it doesn't. People who actually are familiar with historical method, that are trained at the academic level in history, people like Mike Lacona and Gary Habermas and Craig Keener and Richard Bachman and things like that. And these people encounter Bart. There's all kinds of friction. He's making all kinds of mistakes in the way in which historians practice history, and that comes down and often comes out in those discussions, in those debates. People like Dr. Craig Evans, for example, who's debated Bart several times as well, as Mike Conan has, William Lane Craig. They always have issues with his historical methodology. So he tends to have a methodology that is not consistent, not mainstream. It's usually based on critical scholars more so than historical studies. He's not trained at the academic level on historical methodology. That's beyond question, because he's trained textual critic. That's the only academic degree he's got. His PhD is in textual criticism. It's not in historical studies. He don't have a degree in historical studies. He's not a professional historian. To be a professional historian, you have to at least have a master's degree in history, and usually in most cases you have to have a PhD in history, and he don't have either one. And so he's not a professional historian. And I do know for a fact that one of the things that you're trained at, because I want to get a PhD in history for one thing, one of the things that you're trained at the graduate level, if you're going for history, is in historical methodology. They don't train you in historical methodology when you do textual criticism. They train you in textual critical methodology, which is different from historical methodology. Some of his arguments as a textual critic sometimes flows over, and some of his arguments as a historian as well. But that's all I'm going to say for right now, at least, on the method of Bart Ehrman. But it's usually never, it's never going to be, his method is never it's never a sound method, and it's very inconsistent. I actually have a video in my Bart Ehrman series on this channel. You can go to my channel, look up the Bart Ehrman series and find it, or you could probably go to YouTube search bar and you could put in the Bart Ehrman series. You'll probably find it. It'll probably come up on the first page. And in the Bart Ehrman series, I actually have a video specifically on the methodology of Bart Ehrman. But Bart Ehrman is not a very consistent scholar. He's very inconsistent. And he often encounters friction when he does encounter people who have speciality in those areas and those fields of study. In any given case, his methodology is not a very good methodology.
He's got this brand new course coming out, which is titled In the Beginning, History, Legends, and Myth in Genesis. And that's what I'm here to kind of help delve into a bit. So without further ado, here is the interview that I had with Dr. Bart Ehrman. All right, okay, so Dr. Ehrman, I really hope that some of these questions are gonna strike you as original, but I feel the need to cover some of the basics before we really get into it, just to kind of provide a background for the fact that we're talking about Genesis. We're talking about the historical and academic interpretation of Genesis. So I wanted to start by asking you, how does the Genesis story compare? So Genesis 1 and 2, how do they compare to other sort of creation stories of the location, of the ancient Near East?
Yeah, so Genesis begins off with the creation in chapters 1 and 2, and it's interesting that 1 and 2 actually are two different creation stories that are odds with each other.
This is false. They're actually not two different creation stories at all. Chapter 2 actually, if chapter 2 was a separate creation story from chapter 1, then it would cover all kinds of fundamental areas that Genesis 1 covered. Like, it would cover the creation of the world and the universe. It would cover the origin of stars and planets and things like that. Or, it's not a separate creation account. If it was a separate creation account, it would do that. Instead, it's focused on man and the origin of man and woman and their placement in the Garden of Eden, and to till the ground and work the ground. And it sets up chapter 3 that's going to be coming up soon in Genesis, and in dealing with the fall and so forth. And so chapter 2, they're given the commandment and that sort of thing. But it's clearly not a separate creation account, and it doesn't contradict. But I will get into that in a little bit, because he will cover that here in a little bit, what he thinks is contradictions in the narrative of what he thinks is a contradiction narrative. But we'll cover that in here in a second.
But there are similarities, especially to Genesis 1, with other stories in the ancient Near East. We have a story called the Enuma Elish, which is this older story that has very...
Okay. Enuma Elish, first of all, is not the older story. Genesis is actually the older story. Genesis goes back to like the 1400s when Moses wrote it, and the which is in BCE or BC era, it's always the higher the number, the further back it is. Okay, so the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian account, which is the Babylonian account of creation. I've got it on my computer, by the way. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a little bit, because he's going to make some really hilarious mistakes there too. But at any rate, this idea that this is the older story. Now, the Enuma Elish dates to 1100 BCE, whereas Genesis 1400. Now, he'll take the position of the documentary hypothesis. This is going to come out in this interview, and that's why he's trying to claim that Enuma Elish is older, because he's trying to argue that he thinks Genesis was written later. Now, he has no evidence for a late date for Genesis, and we'll get into that. But it's not the case. Genesis is earlier than the Enuma Elish is, and there's fundamental differences between them. I can give you all kinds of differences. For one thing, the style of literature, the literary style, also known as literary genre, is actually different in Enuma Elish. Enuma Elish is actually written, and this is true of the other ancient Near Eastern texts as well. It's written in a poetic style, which is very different from Genesis. Genesis, all of the book of Genesis is written in what's called historical narrative, which is very different. We'll cover that a little bit more later, but historical narrative is essential for understanding, because we got all kinds of evidence within the text and outside the text as well. The book of Genesis is regarded as historical narrative, which is very different from what you see in ancient Near Eastern texts, which is written in poetic. Also, these ancient Near Eastern texts, they tend to they always refer to creation from pre-existing matter, whereas Genesis records the creation of matter from absolutely nothing, as in Genesis 1:1 shows all of the universe coming into existence, space, time, and matter, where it didn't come from a pre-existing thing. And these other ancient Eastern texts often have kind of like an either world, either realm that all, the battles and chaos is happening in and that sort of thing prior to the creation of everything, whereas Genesis starts out at the very beginning, the creation of everything. You got the fact that these accounts, they often start off with chaos. In fact, they're all of them like that. A lot of the ancient creation accounts, if you look at ancient creation accounts, even later ones, as well as earlier ones, they tend to start out with chaos, either in a state of chaos or ensnared by chaos, like in a battle or something of that nature. And like Enuma Elish is the same way. And even Greek stories of creation later on, Greek gods and things like that did the same thing. And you find that true, probably not just of ancient stories, you probably find that of other creation stories as well, but the biblical story is different because it doesn't start in a state of chaos. In fact, it goes the opposite. It goes from order to chaos happening after sin. So it's the exact opposite of what we see in ancient stories. And of course, this is a monotheistic viewpoint, which is different from these other stories, which is a polytheistic viewpoint as well. So you have that. What a lot of these Bible critics will do is that they tend to gloss over the fundamental differences, and they try to highlight superficial similarities. And the interesting thing is that what they never actually consider is the reason why there's any similarity at all is because they all go back to a core story. They all go back to the original story that sprung out from. Genesis is likely the original story because it tends to have the more sober accounts. Whereas if you look at these ancient Near Eastern texts, they're often got lots and lots of distortions in it. We're going to get a little bit more into Enuma Elish, ripping Tiamat in half and making the earth and the universe out of it, or the universe out of one half and the earth out of the bottom half, and things like in the case of the flood narrative in the Babylonian flood tale, which is a epic of Gilgamesh, and the boat is all even on all sides, so it's like a cube floating there, and in turbulent waters this would have actually capsized. so you got all these kinds of distortions that probably likely dwelled into after the Tower of Babel incident. They carry the creation story, Genesis 1 through 11. That's why you get stories, and it's not just stories in ancient Near East, by the way. These stories are all over the world, and the reason why you get them is because of the Babylonian, the story of the Tower of Babel. They spread out the table of nations. They spread out all over the world. They carry the story of Genesis 1 through 11. That's why you don't hear chapters 12 through 50 anywhere around the world. You just hear chapters 1 through 11. Me and Tim Chafee talked about that in our last interview that we did together on the Genesis series. So please watch that for more details of that. All right, let's continue.
Many similarities to the Genesis creation story, and so whoever wrote Genesis is not like making stuff up out of his head, and he's heard stories and they've adapted the stories for their own Israelite context.
No, there's no evidence at all that this is based on oral communications. There's none from the text, nothing from Genesis 1 through 11. There's no references in Genesis. There's no historical sources. There's nothing. This is all speculation that he's making right now. The Toledos, the series of Toledos in Genesis 1 to 11 seems to fight against the idea that this is based on just oral communication. Most likely, Moses is using written records. So he also has the revelation of God, and God's communicating with Moses one way or the other, and so he has those things as well. But in any given case, there's no evidence at all that this is based on stories. Now, what we do believe, we do say that the other creation accounts and like the Babylonian account of creation, Enuma Elish, and others are based on oral stories that are being passed around. That we have evidence for. There's no evidence at all of Genesis being the same way. So this is completely false. He's speculating. He might think that that's the case. He might have an opinion that that's the case, but there's no evidence that it is. He's just assuming.
Yeah, that kind of adds, I'm going to kind of go out of order because that touched on something that I wanted to kind of see your thoughts on, because I've heard before that Genesis has almost acts as a polemic after the Babylonian captivity. So that the reason why it takes so much sort of from some of these other A&E sources is because it's sort of this way of the Hebrews to say, yeah, it's fine that you think Marduk or whoever did this creation, but actually it was Yahweh who really did it. So we'll just take your story, tweak it, and make it our own. What do you think about that?
All right, to start with, I don't know of any young Earth Christians that would argue that. Young Earth Christians usually argue that Genesis is the earlier account, that the Enuma Elish and other things like that were the later account. So Genesis would not need to borrow anything from these other texts. And also another thing, young Earth Christians do not argue that it's a polemic against these other accounts and stuff like that. Just kind of read what we actually write on the subject matter. Now, there might be some theistic evolutionists that might argue that, but young Earth Christians don't argue that. Now, we may argue that it's a polemic against certain pagan cultures and stuff like that existed at the time, like the Egyptians. There's some polemic stuff in there. The fact that the sun and moon, for example, is omitted in the text is a big shout out against these kind of pagan cultures and things like that, because they were often sun worshippers. But there's nothing within the text of Genesis that would indicate, because that would seem to assume that it's a later account from these other things. Enuma Elish is dated to 1100 BCE. Genesis is dated to the 1400s when Moses had written it. Again, Bart and Erika both are assuming a late date for Genesis using the what's called the documentary hypothesis. This is going to come in as well as they are discussing these issues. And we're going to get to that here in a little bit.
It's possible. It's certainly possible. In the Babylonian story, Marduk is as you said, is the main god, and Marduk creates the world in a similar way to the way God creates the world in Genesis.
Wow. Wow. When I first heard him say that, I about flipped over backwards. All right. In Enuma Elish, I've actually got Enuma Elish on my computer. Let me see if I can bring it up. Okay, I've got this pulled up side by side now. Okay, let's go here. Pull up Genesis 1. Okay, this is in the ESV. Okay, I could do the same thing with the King James Version if you want me to. It doesn't matter which one I do. You're going to find it to be the same as far as the basics. So it's going to be the same regardless. But look over here. As far as the fundamentals, I mean, it's going to be different wording. But the essential is going to be the same, regardless which one you do. But I think I want the Hebrew over here. So you can kind of see the difference here. Alright. This is Enuma Elish. This is the first tablet of it, so this is the very beginning of it. He says that it looks like it's the same, and it starts out the same. This is completely false. Okay, this right here, Enuma Elish starts off in kind of an either world, either. It kind of started before the creation of anything, so it's basically like a number round, pretty much. With the Genesis account, you see that it starts at the beginning. Bereshith bara Elohim eighth Hashamayim Ba'ath Haharetz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. All right. See here, in the beginning, right here, God created the heavens and the earth. That's how it starts off. This is how the Enuma Elish starts off, okay? Hopefully y'all can see this clearly. If you can't full size it, that might help allow y'all to be able to see the text bigger and better. All right. When in the height of, this is Enuma Elish, when in the height heaven was not named, and the earth beneath did not bear a name. So this is before the creation of everything. And the primeval, I might need my reading glasses on. Epsu, who begat them, and chaos. Okay, notice this starts off with chaos. This is the opposite from what we see in Genesis, because Genesis starts off with the order being good. Even says it, the light was good, and it keeps going on about it being good. You go down and you see other references to good. See the countries, and it was good, and you go all the way down, and eventually it will end up saying very good. It'll say good 6 different times, and it'll say very good ultimately. You don't get to things being messed up and chaos and stuff until after sin gets committed. So this is the exact opposite of what we see here. This starts off in chaos. And chaos, Tiamat, the mother of them both, this is a goddess, their waters were mingled together, and no field was formed, no marsh was to be seen. Now try to understand, this is written in very poetic language. This is not true of Genesis. In Genesis, this is historical narrative. You could follow the Hebrew down to what's called a va'ito, just like and God said, like in verse 3 here, you see that and you see that right there, where you see the Hebrew right here, with the vav and add it into the imperfect verb. Well, that is called a va'ito, and you actually see kind of like a series of va'itos that start to show up, and down there with the vav consecutive added to the imperfect verb, and to make what's called a va'ito. And the series of va'itos indicates that this is indeed historical narrative. This is not Hebrew poetry; it's Hebrew historical narrative. Here you see a poetic form that's clearly here, and it's throughout Enuma Elish, because all of Enuma Elish is in poet, and this is something recognized by scholars as well, that it's all poetic. This is not something you find in the Genesis account. It says the waters were mingled together, no field was formed, no marsh was to be seen. And this is taking place before the beginning of everything, but this right here starts at the beginning. You see a huge difference here. And none were named, no destinies were ordained. Then they created the gods in the midst of the heavens. So you got the creation of the gods. Limu and Lahamu were called into being. Ages increased. Then Ansar and Kisar were created. And it goes on like that. And it keeps going until finally it gets to Tiamat. Now, here's the part that's going to be laughable to me. I'm gonna take this off. I want you to see this side by side so you can see this is very different. But I'm about to go into some details about Enuma Elish. Enuma Elish, Tiamat. Let me take my glasses off. In Enuma Elish, Tiamat is killed in a battle. It's chaos, it's a battle. This is the way all of the creation accounts outside of Genesis did it. Genesis does the exact opposite. But Tiamat is killed in a battle. Tiamat is killed in a battle, and her body is torn in half. One half of it's used to create the universe, the rest of the universe, the stars and so forth, and the other half is used to create the world. Very different from the Genesis account. We don't see that in the Genesis account at all. It's completely different. This is why I laughed at that. That was so funny. It's like, what part of the Enuma Elish is supposed to be the same or similar to the Genesis account? Nothing. It's not similar. I mean, it might be similar in the sense that, creation happened. Of course, there's some superficial similarities, but there's some fundamental differences that are being glossed over by this view here. It's very different. So no, Enuma Elish is not the same as the Genesis account. It's very different, and this is something scholars that recognize. It's fundamentally different. I mean, there's no doubt about it. So what part of Enuma Elish is supposed to be the same? Now, Bart does not give us an explanation to that. He does not explain what part of Enuma Elish is supposed to be similar. He doesn't give any examples. He doesn't go into it. He doesn't illustrate. He doesn't do what I just did. He don't do any of those things. He just claims it. These kinds of bombshells that Bart Ehrman does, they're typical Ehrman. They're Ehrman's MO. That's what he does. He throws out these bombshells. And just they're just blanket assertions. They're just plain assertions. That's all they are. They don't actually have any actual evidence behind them. And I guess the hope is that people won't actually go out and read Enuma Elish. But you can find it online for free. I have it online for free. I copied it all and put it on a Word document, make it easy for me and be able to find things if I need to find them and that sort of thing. But clearly, you could look this stuff up. It's not the same. You read the Enuma Elish, it's very different from the creation account. Now, there could be some superficial similarities. I think all the creation accounts ultimately go back to the Genesis as the original account. Same thing with the flood stories. I think all of it originally goes back to the Genesis account. But there's going to be a tremendous amount of distortions in those other accounts. And so I think there's a lot of distortions in it. There's paganism. There's all kinds of stuff that just kind of messes the story up. But I think the Genesis account was the original story. And I think that the Genesis account is the true story and the most accurate as well. All right, let's continue. I thought that was hilarious. But it does show that Bart Ehrman and Erika don't know a lot of stuff about this stuff. Not at all. And they don't specialize in it. It's not an area of speciality for even Ehrman. It's not his speciality. Academically, and I would say even personally, because if he had any kind of area of expertise, he would know the statement that the Genesis account and Enuma Elish is a lot alike is bogus. It's a bogus statement, and there could be some deception involved as well. But I'm not going to go into that right now. All right, let's continue.
it does look like this part of Genesis was written after the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century. It comes from a source.
All right. He's basing that on the documentary hypothesis, which has no evidence behind it. It's pure speculation. In fact, even the people who hold to it call it a hypothesis. But scholars have recognized a long time that the documentary hypothesis could provide no actual adequate information. The claim is, now there's been lots and lots of versions of the documentary hypothesis. I'm not going to go into, things like the two-source theory and all kinds of versions of the two-source theory, and there's a four-source theory and all the versions of the four-source theory. The most popular view, and I think this is the one that Bart probably holds, is called the four-source theory. There's been versions of that too, but anyway, it's like a JED or JPD. Yeah, I think JEPD, I think it was, or it could be JPED. No, I think it's JEPD. I think that's right. JEPD, and it's called the four-source theory. And the idea is that later on, post-exilic time, some people puts it in the intertestamental period, but basically post-exile, when around 596 and 597 BCE, the Babylonians attacked Jerusalem, destroyed the city of Jerusalem, and exiled the Jews to Babylon. Now, we got several books in the Old Testament that talks about this, as well as the post-exilic period. And we also have the Babylonian Chronicles. The archaeologists found that also documented this. So as far as I know, this is pretty much well-established history, and I think Ehrman probably accepts it as well. But in any given case, the argument is that maybe sometime after that, these four documents existed, and then some later unknown editor took these four documents, put them together, edited them, tweaked them, and came up with the 5 books. They're now the 5 books of Moses. Now, there's no actual evidence that this is the case. There's none. We have no evidence at all that these 4 documents, which don't exist anywhere, and there's not a hint of it anywhere in any historical source, in any archaeological discovery, inscription, nothing. There's not a hint of it in the 5 books of Moses. There's not a hint of it anywhere in the Old Testament. We have no evidence at all of its existence, or that this even happened. That's why this is considered a hypothesis. The view is very, very weak. But essentially, it's based on the idea that God has multiple names of himself. Some people argue that, and Ehrman's going to argue this in a little bit, that they think chapter 1 and chapter 2 appears to be 2 different creation accounts. Some people argue that they think that different aspects of the 5 books of Moses, the stuff about the law and the priesthood and things like that, should be broken up into other sources and things like that. This is actually a what's known as higher criticism. Higher criticism is based on pure speculation. You're not really expected to have evidence in high criticism. It's not like textual criticism. Textual criticism, which Bart Ehrman does actually specialize in, particularly in New Testament textual criticism, is also known as lower textual or lower criticism. And although it lower and higher is just relevant to each other, I'm not really sure why they call it higher or lower. Lower criticism is actually based on facts and evidence, and you're actually expected to prove what you're saying. With higher criticism, it's all speculative. It's all speculation. And people who engage in higher criticism usually ain't really expected to prove anything, really. And so Bart is engaging here in higher criticism in the idea of what's called the four-source theory, or overall referred to as the documentary hypothesis, but it has no actual evidence for it. Multiple names of God, one of the things they found is this does not really prove prove anything as far as them coming together with multiple sources and stuff like that. God's known as by multiple names throughout the Old Testament, not just in the Pentateuch. This idea of, oh, well, God's called Yahweh in chapter 2, but he's only called Elohim in chapter 1. Of course, the Jews early on had a problem with even using the name Yahweh. So a lot of the later manuscripts probably end up including Yahweh in it. The earlier manuscripts might have included Adonai, the common Hebrew word for the Lord. But either way, there's that doesn't justify thinking that it's going to be multiple sources put together and things like that. That don't justify that story. It's pure speculation. Pure speculation. Bart doesn't introduce any evidence. How could he? The people who hold to this position don't introduce any evidence. They claim, they make claims of it. They have an opinion of it. They think it's true. Some people do. I think that most Old Testament scholars don't hold to it. Some do, but I think most Old Testament scholars don't hold to it. I think that the only ones who actually hold to this is usually critical scholars. And usually the people not specializing in the Old Testament or biblical studies or anything like that, that hold to the documentary hypothesis. Now, you could probably argue for like a large group of critical scholars, people outside the area of Old Testament studies, they may hold to this position, because there's a lot of secular scholars that do still hold to it, even though it's obviously easily debunked and there's no actual evidence for it to support it. But in any given case, but you couldn't argue from Old Testament studies. Very few Old Testament scholars ever give it any credit anymore because it doesn't really work. It's like I said, it's pure speculation. It's ad hoc. It's non-evidence. If Bart Ehrman, you don't see Bart Ehrman debating the subject matter of Genesis. He debates other subjects, but you don't see him debating the subject of Genesis. Why not? Because one thing, he's not an Old Testament scholar, and number two, he brings this kind of stuff with somebody that's actually going to challenge him face to face with this stuff. How in the world would he ever be able to defend what he said? Statements like, well, Genesis is similar to Enuma Elish. We can show you Enuma Elish. It's not the same. It's not similar. It's very different. So, so he could never demonstrate any of this. A documentary hypothesis. His usual MO, when he's backed in the corner and he can't demonstrate what he says, his usual MO is to bring up scholars to agree with him, and sometimes he'll even bring up universities, because there's a lot of secular universities and there's a lot of secularism at some universities. Some of the Christian universities are starting to become much more secularized, maybe a lot more Christian universities than should be, starting to get secular influences on them and things like that, unfortunately. And his usual MO is to do stuff like that. Now, you could do that to some degree, but you wouldn't be able to do it with experts that were relevant to the subject matter. And most Old Testament scholars appear to be Christian. Some of them are Christian, but they're theistic evolutionists. But theistic evolutionists often disagree with each other. And some of the theistic evolutionists that would agree with Bart, on this, they're not really a mainstream position. And there's even theistic evolutionists that wouldn't agree with this. So they go either way. But in any given case, there's no real credible argument that could be made for the documentary hypothesis. But obviously he takes that position and he doesn't provide any justification for it. He just makes the assertion. Yes, I know. I'm wearing a different shirt now. I'm kind of doing this video over time, so that's the reason why. So, but don't mind that. All right. I'm just kind of splicing it together at the end. But I'm watching it and recording this. But all right, let's get back to it.
Genesis is usually thought to be made up of a number of different sources by scholars.
Right.
It's not, Moses didn't write it, but it's a number of sources written at different times. And
All right. There's no. This is called the documentary hypothesis. Even those who hold to the view refer to it as a hypothesis. It's not actually. There's no actual evidence for any of this. None. The evidence within the text indicates that Moses did, both in the text and outside of the text, indicates that Moses did indeed write it. For example, it uses Egyptian terminology. It's familiar with Egyptian geography in the 1400s, in the second millennium BC. And you got all kinds of evidence of Moses actually writing it, and it even contributes it both inside the Pentateuch and outside the Pentateuch to Moses writing it. Jesus even contribute Moses as being the writer of the Pentateuch. In fact, the earliest Jewish understanding of who wrote the Pentateuch is Moses. It's the earliest and the best. There's zero evidence that it's written in the post-exilic period. Some people try to claim it's in the intermediate period. No. There's no evidence of that. There's no evidence of Moses didn't writing it. There's no evidence of some other writer writing it. There's no evidence at all, even a hint of it being compiled later together, edited together as, from 4 different sources that no longer extant. There's no evidence at all that those 4 sources ever existed. None. And so there's not a hint of it in the Pentateuch. There's not a hint of it in any other part of the Old Testament. There's not a hint of it in any historical source that we have. There's not a hint of it in any inscription, any archaeological discovery, etc., 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 etc. There's no evidence at all of this. There's nothing to indicate that it's post-exilic. The terminology, if it was post-exilic, we would expect a lot more Aramaic, but there's no Aramaic at all in the Pentateuch. There's just no evidence at all that would suggest this. They get this because they see multiple names in the Pentateuch, and they think that multiple writers wrote it, but God is often referred to as multiple names throughout the Old Testament. The evidence is in that Moses is the one who wrote it. And I think most Old Testament scholars lean to that conclusion. Now, if you were to sit there and maybe look at scholars outside the relevant field of Old Testament studies, secular scholars, that might be writing on this, people like Bart, things like that, then sure, you can have a whole lot more secularists, on your side and that sort of thing. But if you're just looking strictly at the Old Testament scholars, most of them would abandon the documentary hypothesis. That's why you don't hardly ever hear anything about it anymore, because it's not really a view that can be substantiated by evidence. Now, this might be what Bart thinks. It might be his personal opinion, but there's no evidence behind it. None. I would challenge Bart to produce a shred of evidence for the documentary hypothesis. It does not exist. There is no evidence for documentary hypothesis. He might think that. He might think it, and he asserts it like he thinks it. But it's not the case. There's no evidence for it. If it was evidence for it, don't you think Bart would present evidence for it? He doesn't present evidence for it because there's no evidence for it. But either way, there's no evidence or any indication that it's been edited later, or that it should be dated to post-exilic, or that Moses didn't write it. And all the evidence that we do have suggests that Moses did write it. It fits the world of the second millennium BCE. It has common the Egyptian terminology and geography and knowledge of their beliefs and systems and that sort of thing in Egypt is so strong that it'd be a hard pass to say that the writer of Pentateuch was not literally, physically in Egypt at one given point before he wrote the Pentateuch. Because he had to have known about the geography, he had to know about the history, he had to know about the culture, he had to know about the terminology. There's no doubt at all that that's the case. And you can find an entire case just on Moses writing the Pentateuch. And I'm not going to go too much into this. The documentary hypothesis has no real substance. It's based on multiple names, which is a non sequitur. It doesn't follow logically to assume that it must be multiple sources if they're using multiple names. People in ancient times have multiple names. That don't mean it's made of multiple sources. The gospel shows people having multiple names. Jesus has multiple names. That's usually common in ancient times anyhow for people, or in this case God, to be designated with multiple names. In fact, he's designated with multiple names throughout the Old Testament. That doesn't prove that it must be multiple sources. That's a silly argument, but that's the way it goes. Sometimes they try to say that they think that Genesis 1 and 2 are two different creation accounts, but that's not true. There are fundamental things missing from Genesis 2 to indicate this is not a creation account at all. Or there's fundamental things missing from Genesis 2 to indicate this is not a second creation account at all. Rather, instead, there's evidence that within the text of Genesis 2, such as Genesis 2:4, linking it to Genesis 1 to indicate that it's a focused account on the creation itself. We'll probably get into that here in a little bit because he's probably going to mention chapter 2 and that sort of thing. And so we'll cover that here in a second. But there's no evidence at all for the documentary hypothesis. Now, it might be what Bart thinks. It might be fits his secular views and that sort of thing, but I guess Erika probably agrees with them because she don't know anything about biblical studies. Bart doesn't know anything about biblical studies, not in terms of the field of biblical studies as well as Old Testament studies, and so he's throwing this in there and making the claim that this has happened, or this is what took place, when there's no evidence at all. No historical evidence, no archaeological evidence, no archival evidence, no internal evidence, nothing within the text to indicate this, nothing outside the text to indicate this. This is pure speculation, 100%. Absolutely.
Beginning of Genesis chapter 1 is a source called the P source that's usually dated to the 6th century after the Babylonian.
Again, this is according to the documentary hypothesis, which is speculation. It's not actual fact. He asserts it like it's a fact. That's false. It's not even the majority opinion anymore among Old Testament scholars. It is probably the majority opinion among, like, say, secularists. A lot of secular scholars, including a lot of secular scholars outside the area of Old Testament studies. But it's not the majority opinion of the Old Testament scholars. At least not anymore. At one time it might have been. Now it's kind of fallen out of favor for a while because, like I said, it lacks evidence. There's evidence against it. There's no historical reason to take that. It's speculation. It doesn't follow logically with the whole names thing. And there's nothing to indicate these other sources. And by the way, there are different versions of the documentary hypothesis. I think I mentioned that earlier, but there's different versions of the documentary hypothesis. So you got you got the P source, like you mentioned. You got J source, E source, D source. P is supposed to be priestly, plus the stamp of priestly. D is Deuteronomy or Deuteronomic. And you got E is supposed to be Elohim. J is supposed to be Jehovah. I mean, you basically got these sources, and not all versions of the four source theory. You got different versions of the four source theory, and you also have what's called the two source theory, which is also different versions of it. So you got two source theory, you got four source theory, and you got different versions of these as well. And over time, throughout history, there are different scholars who who have proposed the documentary hypothesis, proposed different versions and that sort of thing, because you're dealing with speculation. So naturally, you're going to deal with something that's going to change a lot over time because of the fact that you're basically guessing at it anyhow. You're making a guess. You're making a claim that has no evidence, and when you make a claim that has no evidence, you pretty much can make it your own. And essentially, that's what they did. But any given case, there's no evidence here.
Captivity, and so it may well be that that it's a polemic against this Babylonian story, or it may just be that this is like they're tweaking the story. The thing is, since we can't get into the author's head, we don't know if he's like really going after those Babylonians. Or if he's like, well, that's a useful story. I'm going to modify this. This they're onto something here.
Yeah, it's not a polemic against Babylonian because, again, it's written way before or then. Or at least before then. The Genesis account is written around the 1400s. They probably likely used earlier sources. The Babylonian account of creation in Enuma Elish is written around the 1100s. So Genesis is actually the earlier source than that. What Bart is doing is he's assuming the Genesis is written after, because he thinks the documentary hypothesis is true. So he's assuming that it's written after Enuma Elish, and this is just false. And of course, you don't go from a much more distorted account to a much more sober account. That's not how you do it. It usually goes from the much more sober account to the much more distorted account. And so if you got a distortion, like in the case of Enuma Elish, with lots and lots of distortions, you got Tiamat halfway being made. You got it's starting out in chaos. You got another realm that it's starting out and things like that. And it wouldn't be a polemic against that. There's nothing in it to indicate that this is responding to that, because that story has not yet been written. So there's no way it could be a polemic, because it's Genesis predates it. It's based on even earlier sources than Genesis as well, because it's got the series of Toledotes in there to indicate written sources that predate the book of Genesis. I think there's strong internal grounds for that as well. But anyway, no, it's not a polemic.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Hard to tell.
Yeah, I've heard it said before that, it's difficult enough to translate a language, but to translate a culture is a different animal entirely. which leads me, I argue here online with young Earth creationists, being as my background is. I like human evolution, and I think evolutionary biology is fascinating. So naturally, the ancient age of the Earth and, the sort of animal nature of humans clashes with that young Earth creationism, who kind of suppose that they're taking Genesis as purely and as literally and as God intended, as a sort of correct interpretation. And one of the things that they tend to say is, that Genesis 1 is this creation story, and Genesis 2 hones in on Adam and Eve specifically. What do you make of that? Is Genesis 1 creation story or 2?
It's 2 creation stories. I don't think there's much doubt about that from anybody who just, unless you've got a faith commitment that says they have to be the same.
All right, that's false. It is very clear that Genesis 1 and 2 are not separate creation accounts. If that was the case, then the expectation would be that Genesis 2 would have references to creation of the universe, creation of the world, creation of stars. We would expect all of these things if this was another creation account. Rather, instead, it is a focused creation account that focuses on the creation of man. So it's clearly zeroing in on that particular area. So it's not a separate creation account at all. And it's actually very clear the opposite of what Bart's saying, that this is not a separate creation account. If it was, we would expect the creation of the world being repeated, or the creation of stars or sun or moon or something of that nature. But instead, what we get is the creation of man, and it references animals and plants, but it's not talking about the creation. Plants is talking about cultivated plants in the Garden of Eden, because it hasn't yet rains and grown up plants yet, and you could tell from the text and the context that this is cultivated plants that it's referring to. The only one that really is more of a challenge is probably the animals, because it talks about the animals, and some people pounce on that in the order of events because the animals are referenced, and then man is referenced, but if you actually look at the way it's translated and the context of that translation more particularly, it is likely that that text is written in what's called pluperfect form. And I will get into this a little bit because Bart's going to cover a few examples where he thinks that the Genesis 2 is contradicting Genesis 1, and when he does, I'm going to go into that. I'm going to return to the video in just a moment, but first I want to deliver this message. Again, don't forget chapter 2 coming soon. In fact, it'll be the start of chapter 2 will be the very next video following this one. I can't wait. I'm looking forward to it. There's going to be a lot of creation versus evolution videos in that chapter that we're going to do on the Genesis series. I can't wait for it. So please join me on here. If you're not subscribed to my channel, please do so. Like the video and so forth. Now let's jump back into our response.
Then if you just read them, they're different stories, and they're quite clearly different. I talk about this I devote an entire lecture just to this particular issue in my course. But the thing is, when you read the Adam and Eve story in chapter 2, it is explicit that there are no plants on earth yet. There are no animals on earth yet. God makes Adam first. Then he puts the plant life there. Then he makes the animals.
Right.
And in Genesis 1, it's the other way around.
Right.
All right. Let's go to that and let's talk about that real quick. All right, here we are. We are looking at Genesis 2 here. You got here the ESV. Here's the King James Version if you prefer that. All right. Now, and look here. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. This is the Toledoth. Okay, it says, when no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground. Okay, here, the objection is that, oh, well, God's supposed to create plants on day 3, but here it shows plants being created on day 6. But that is false. This right here is talking about cultivated plants. The reason why we know this is because of the actual context. If you look at the text, it says that that there was no rain that had yet fell upon the land right here, and there was no man to work the ground. Talking about because God's going to place man in a garden, and since man had not yet been created yet, because this is day 6, therefore this is referring to what's called cultivated plants, which basically means plants that are being taken care of so that they could sprout up and that sort of thing. It's talking about natural order of plants. It's not talking about the plants that were created on day 6. And talking about, it's talking about plants that's cultivated, that's being nurtured, that's being prepared, that's being gardened, and so forth. That's what it's referring to. It's not talking about the plants in general on day 3. So this right here is not referring to day 3 at all. You go back further to like verse 19, I believe. And this is talking about the animals formation. It says, now out of the ground the Lord God had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heaven, and brought them to man to see what he would call them. Had formed is referring to over here. Let me move downward here. Right here, it's referring to this word right here. It's a verb consecutive added to an imperfect verb. It's called a verb imperfect or a valito. And essentially, this makes this a, at least in terms of the tense of it, that will becomes like past perfect. Now, the tense is normally determined by the context in Hebrew. And Hebrew doesn't have a pluperfect. A pluperfect is basically a past event that happened prior to an aforementioned event. So in this case, this is happening before the formation of the animals happened before God brought them to Noah or to Adam to see what he would name them, and before man was actually created. And this is why the ESV translates this as had formed. See how the King James translates it, just translates it's formed, and without the had. It didn't translate that as a pluperfect, and so some people jump on that. But there's several different modern Bible translations translate this that way. A lot of Hebrew scholars think it should be translated as pluperfect. They didn't have a pluperfect in Hebrew, but the tense is determined by the context, and it's pretty clear that it is intended to be had formed, not formed, just formed. There's actually a lot of Bible translation also prior to the modern era. Actually, prior to the King James, actually translated this as a pluperfect. Like the Wycliffe Bible, the Bishop Bible, and several others dating all the way back to the 1500s prior to the King James, and also had translated as a pluperfect. This seems to fit the context the best, and therefore that's the reason why the ESV translates it as a pluperfect. And this is how you should translate that. This is Yetzer. And so this Hebrew word right here should be translated as had formed, and it is referring to the animals that were formed prior to them being brought to Adam, prior to Adam's creation. The animals that were formed either right on day 6 or, well, yeah, because I think day 5 is the sea creature. So day 6, these animals were formed on day 6, but they were prior to Adam's formation. So there's no actual contradiction here when you look at it. Now, even if there was a contradiction in the text, that wouldn't prove a different source or anything like that. Bart also thinks there are contradictions in other places in the Bible and the Gospels and so forth, but he doesn't think they're written, by different people. He might argue he doesn't think that they're written by the traditional authorship, but he won't argue that they're being written by different people. So the mere use of alleged contradiction would not necessarily prove that anyhow. That's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow logically. But at the end of the day, it is just it's going to be for one thing, the alleged contradiction just kind of goes away when you realize this is a pluperfect anyhow, and so it becomes a translational issue. But either way, even if there was alleged Bible contradiction, and there isn't, but even if there was, it wouldn't prove that this is an alternate source, and which is what Bart's obviously trying to justify here. In reality, this is really stretching it to try to argue for a separate creation account. This certainly doesn't argue for different sources, by the way. There's nothing about that. Even if there was a contradiction here, there isn't. But even if there was, it wouldn't argue for a different source being written or a different writer being written, that sort of thing. That's just non sequitur. That's just being illogical. But there's no indication that that's the case. But rather, and the evidence seems to suggest that this is definitely a zeroed-in creation account. It's a specific account of the creation of man, where the details are specific and specified. And man is placed in his garden, and in order to cultivate the plants, in order for the plants to spring up, man has to work and till the ground, and God creates a mist over the ground also to aid the plants to be able to spring up, because it hadn't rained yet at this time, because this is still early on, for one thing. And the formation of the animals happened on previously to man, creation of man, on either day 5 or day 6, but it's previous to the creation of man, definitely. And the best way to translate that would be as a pluperfect as well.
It's not only that both don't work scientifically. Obviously, it doesn't work for humans to do the first thing. That doesn't work scientifically. But also, just
why would it work scientifically? Start with, what does science have to do with this in the first place? This is historical. This isn't science. It's historical. So science would have nothing to do with it anyhow.
Genesis 1 doesn't work scientifically because plant life is created before there's a sun.
Right.
Wow. Wow. Plant life created before there's a sun. Okay. Plants are created on day 3. Sun is created on day 4. 1 day difference. Not millions of years, 1 day difference. All right. This is so laughable. They think it's laughable for a different reason, but it is laughable because the fact of the matter is that there's 2 major problems with this claim. Okay, the first problem is assuming that you have to have the sun to have plant life. That shows ignorance of botany. We have indoor plants that I don't have indoor plants. I'm talking about people in general have indoor plants inside their homes. And how do they have indoor plants? Well, they use UV lighting, because all you really have to have is a light source that can emit UV light. That's all you have to have. You don't actually have to have the sun to have plants. And we already have light, because we have light on day 1. It says, let there be light. If this light is supposed to be similar to the sunlight that would later come into being in day 4, then most likely it has probably got UV light. It's probably UV light that's being emitted. And so that would provide light for plants and stuff like that. You don't actually have to have the sun to make plants work. That shows ignorance of botany, because people have indoor plants all the time. So that's just silly. But the second thing, the thing that I really think this makes laughable, is the idea that a plant cannot survive longer than 1 day without the sun. How does Bart think that plants survive in shady areas, or in areas and regions of the world that don't get that much sun, or overnight, or at times when it could rain in tropical areas where it could rain from anywhere from days to weeks, and there could be very little sunlight or no sunlight at all? What would that happen at? Or during an eclipse or something like that. The idea that plants won't survive more than 1 day without the sun is false. It's a myth. It shows ignorance of botany is what it is. And of course, neither one of these 2 specializes in botany. So they don't specialize in that. So they don't realize that plants can survive longer than 1 day without the sun. Otherwise, it would die out every time. If it's an eclipse, if there's shadows, if in regions of the world with get very little sunlight, and they don't get much sunlight, or in other times when the sun is absent for days, like in case of storms, where they can't sit there and because some storms, especially in tropical areas, could go on for days and even weeks, and so with that, I mean, but this idea that plants somehow will die out if they don't have sun in 24 hours, it's a silly argument. It really is. So it is laughable, but not for the reason they think it's laughable. It's laughable because plants don't require sunlight in 24 hours or they die. That's silly. Plants can actually survive longer. Some plants even store up sunlight. I mean, so for long periods of time. So this idea that they can't survive without the sun for 24 hours is just false. But we know that light was created on day one, because Bible says God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. If this light is supposed to be a temporary source, temporary to the sun, light, which hasn't been created yet until day 4, then we would expect it to be a type of UV light source. So it would have had sunlight or have UV light regardless. You don't actually have to have the sun. You can have indoor plants. You don't have the sun inside indoors. Do you? No. I actually have a video with Dr. Jason Lau, and we talked about this stuff it's in my The Origin of the Universe video with Dr. Jason Lau on the Genesis series. I will link it in the description box below, because this is just absolutely ridiculous. But it shows true ignorance of botany. This idea that somehow if you go 20 miles, it's gonna the plants are gonna die out. Or that the plants require sunlight. No, they require UV light. You don't have to have sunlight. You can actually have UV light. That's why people can have indoor plants. It just shows true ignorance of botany is what it does.
Right.
I mean, it's like, and so
It's difficult, right? It might be a little bit hard pill to swallow.
I don't see how that's a hard pill to swallow. It's only a hard pill to swallow if you have no knowledge of plants. If you have knowledge of plants, well, then it's not really a hard pill to swallow at all. It's even harder to realize to think that you would think that plants would die out if they go 24 hours without sunlight. That's a harder pill to swallow, because there are times when they do. But in any given case, no, it's not a hard pill to swallow.
I mean, I do think these are great. They're great myths, and they're important myths. But if you take them scientifically, you're just missing the boat.
They're not myths, and when they touch on science, they're completely accurate. There's nothing about that account with the plants on day 3 is scientifically inaccurate. No. It sounds to me like they don't understand plants at all. Again, how do they justify indoor plants? How do they justify times when there's very little sunlight, if any, in some cases no sunlight at all for days at a time? Do they think plants are just all going to die out across the world? If they don't get sunlight every second? I mean, exactly how do they justify that in their mind? I wonder. Let's continue.
You just
Yeah.
way to read them.
Well, yeah, and that kind of leads me to ask, has it always been the case within the church that Genesis, and certainly within the Christian church, but passed into the sort of Jewish history as well? Has it always been the case that there's been a sect of folks who want to take Genesis literally, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, so I think until the Enlightenment, until the 17th century, people just didn't. Occasionally, somebody would say, "Well, that looks like a contradiction," but people just didn't think that way. The Bible was the authority, and they didn't question it. And they didn't have any scientific grounds for questioning it. They didn't know. And
okay. All right. The objection is, well, they just didn't know, and they didn't have science. This is kind of what some people call like an evolutionary thinking, where they think that everybody back then was dummies, and people didn't actually start getting smart until the so-called Enlightenment. This is a silly argument. There was actually smart people back then, so this is just kind of silly. There's nothing wrong with thinking the Bible is the authority or word of God. So he just kind of assumed that since that's the only reason, therefore that Bible must not be trusted. Well, if the Bible really is the inspired and inerrant word of God, this would not be a silly reason to think that way. It would only be that way if that was not the case. But if it was the case, then there's no reason not to think that way. But these people weren't dummies. There was a lot of smart people back then. There's people that today they're born just smart. They're highly intelligent, Just like there's smart people today, there were smart people then. This idea of everybody was stupid back then, and people didn't actually start getting a brain in their head until the Enlightenment, or so-called Enlightenment, what some people call the Endarkenment. Doesn't work very well. But anyway, but no, people were smart back then as well. But that's not the only reason that they accepted. They accepted it because it was true. I mean, that's basically. But as far as, again, what they are understanding on the word literal, it may not be exactly what young Earth creationists mean by it. So it may not be, may not be meaning the same thing that we mean when we use the word, if we use the term. Most young Earth Christians have gotten away from using the word literal because people have a different idea about what they think it's talking about, and we're not talking about that, and that leads to people doing strawman arguments and that sort of thing, like assuming that we don't think there's any figures of speech in the Bible and that sort of thing, or assuming that we don't accept that language is not rigid and that there's room for exaggerations, hyperboles, and so forth. And that's just a strawman argument, a gross misrepresentation of our view, and so forth. But in any given case, we do actually accept that there's figures of speech in the Bible and things like that. But as far as the way people took it, most people accepted the fact that Genesis 1 should be understood in a little fashion. There were some that didn't accept that. So I don't know. Bart doesn't seem to be very familiar with his history. Neither is Erika. But there are some that did accept the non-literary, not millions, billions of years, but did accept a reading that said that they thought that Genesis 1 should be understood as instantaneously, that maybe God created the world instantaneous. There's very few that accepted that argument, but there's some that did, like Augustine or Origen or something. They all believed that the world was less than 10,000 years old. They all did. And this idea of trying to interpret Scripture based on a secular view, secularists, there's no solid scientific reason for accepting that, unless you just kind of assume uniformitarianism and that sort of thing. I don't assume uniformitarianism. I don't agree with uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism is an arbitrary assumption about the past, etc. And so I don't take that. And besides, this isn't science. This is history. This is when you're dealing with the age of the earth, when you're dealing with the creation of the world, it's really more history than science. Now, you could probably make inferences from science and that sort of thing. And in some cases, and in many cases, they're going to be guesses, but that wouldn't be empirical science for sure. But it would not somehow trump the Word of God as a result. The Bible is a book of history, and as a result, it's showing historically this is what took place. And so science would not have anything to do with it. It's the discipline of history. As someone like Bart Ehrman, who claims to be a historian, he should be ready to accept that idea. This is a historical event. But he's also a skeptic, and he's a professed atheist on some days. Some days he's a professed agnostic. But either way, as a result, he wants to look at this not like a historian, not like a scholar, but like a secularist, like someone who is like Erika, just picking up these objections from other atheists and sprouting them out on the internet as if they actually mean something. That's ultimately what they're doing. But this idea, they didn't really know what we know today. I mean, they actually could have even known more than what we know today. I mean, we still don't know how they built things like the pyramids and big monumental construction. We know that they used the Hebrews. We know they did, maybe one stone at a time. We might have some semblance of knowledge, but they were able to do things that just baffles us in what they were able to do. And given their time and their limitations and things like that, it's marvel to us. It really is. And sitting there trying to act like these people were stupid, that they were ignorant, that they didn't know what they were doing because it's a pre-scientific world. It's just a silly argument. It's just a way of trying to make them seem dumber than they actually were. And it just doesn't follow logically.
And how would they know? And so they did take it literally, but it was because there wasn't really an alternative. But
right.
the literal interpretation wasn't the issue for them.
Okay, that's false. To start with, there was an alternative. Okay, there were, like, the School of Alexandria, for example, would take it non-literal, but most as far as Genesis 1, but most Christians took a more straightforward reading of the word, and that's what but they did have alternative with that. I think he's assuming that because they didn't believe in billions of years, that there was no alternative to billions of years. Well, technically speaking, they could have had that as an alternative, but nobody thought that. So it's ridiculous. I guess he's assuming that until radiometric dating was invented, nobody really thought about it. That's false too, by the way. Radiometric dating didn't come about until around I think it was the 20th century, the 1900s, early in the 20th century, like carbon-14 and so forth. And you don't have radiometric dating before that, but yet you still have Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. You had that, and you also had James Hutton. You had Charles Lyell, and these were all people writing before the advent of radiometric dating. So people still recognize the fact that alternative was there. So that's just completely false. It's not because they had no other alternative. It's just because the historical record of the Bible clearly supported a young earth view. It clearly supported a straightforward rendering. This is what the text said. And of course, in hermeneutics, you don't interpret the text based upon whatever is popular in terms of secular views and things like that. You don't do that. That's not a way. That's not even a good way to. It's not a justified way at all to try to interpret the text by. You interpret the text based on what the original writer intended, and that's how you interpret the text. And so if the original writer intended it to be understood as a straightforward rendering, and it would, if we got evidence that it's a Hebrew historical narrative, which we do, then that's how the writer had understood it to be. This idea of taking it non-literal based on some popularized secular view that now exists, it would be strange to apply that eisegetically into scripture. That's called eisegesis. You don't do that. Rather, instead, what we do is we check what the text actually said, and using sound exegetical methods, we then determine what the original writer had. Actually, no, we don't even determine. We discover the meaning that the original writer had intended. That's what we do. We discover it. We don't create it. We don't force meaning into it that's not already there. Rather, instead, we try to extrapolate or retrieve meaning from the text. In fact, that's called exegesis. That's what exegesis is. It means you're taking out of the text. Eisegesis means you're putting into the text. So when you try to import into the text, that's called eisegesis. And we don't want to do that. We want to take from the text. It doesn't matter what's popular. It doesn't matter what's the current secular view. It doesn't matter what other people think. It only matters what the original writer intended. That's what matters there. Let's continue.
It was. You wouldn't even say, "Did you take it literally?" How else am I supposed to take it? But they thought that it really happened. But the point wasn't that it happened. The point was that it's teaching us something.
All right. A couple things here. First of all, I think he is conflating the difference between what the writer originally intended, or the literary genre, and whether or not if he's conflating the literary genre and the idea whether something is historically true or not, that's not the same. Something could be presented as real history and presented in a literary format to present it as real history and still be historically inaccurate. Those are two separate questions. Now, I think the Bible is historically accurate. I think we can justify that. But the point is that if you're dealing with literary genres, then the question is how did the writer intend it to be interpreted? Not how you want it to be interpreted, but how it is intended to be interpreted. Well, if it's Hebrew historical narrative, then it's tended to be interpreted as history. Now, you might not think it's actual history. You might think it's false history. You might think it's pseudo-history. But that's irrelevant to how the writer is presenting it. The writer is presenting it as real history. That's the point. Okay? And if you're talking about what the original writer intended, that's what it intended. If it's Hebrew historical narrative, or any historical narrative, it's intended to be understood as actual literal history. That's what it's intended to be understood. That doesn't mean that it can't be metaphors, but figures of speech are less common, and when they are there, they are heavily contextualized. They're very obvious. They stick out like a sore thumb, and that sort of thing. And so this idea of and what about this idea that Bart said? It's teaching us something. Well, for start, okay, he says it doesn't matter whether it's true or not, and to them it just didn't matter if it's true or not as long as it's teaching us something. Whatever, even if that was true, it's not. But even if it was, the fact that the idea that the Bible must be teaching us something in order to be, or it doesn't matter if it's true or not. Whatever the Bible is teaching us has to be grounded in reality. It doesn't matter. Whatever it's teaching us is going to be completely irrelevant and baseless if it's not grounded in truth. Let me give you an example. Suppose I was talking to Erika about the gospel and that sort of thing. And I tell Erika, you know something? I used to be, now, of course, Erika's not an atheist. She considers herself an agnostic, but let me say that, like, I say, well, I used to be an atheist, and I had, and I can relate to your predicament, but I eventually came to the truth of the existence of God. I came to the truth of the Bible and that sort of thing, and therefore, this is my personal experience, and I deal with that. And then she goes, "Oh, I didn't know you were an atheist, Brian." And then my answer is, "Oh no, I was never an atheist. I always believed in God, but the story I told you was fiction. But it's okay because I taught you something, right?" you would say, "No, that's not right. That's not right at all." What is being taught has to be grounded in truth. If it's not grounded in truth, then what's being taught is completely baseless. Therefore, it's pointless. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to teach something and be false. That's called a lie. That's what that's called. That's called lying. That's not, and it's baseless. It's pointless. You don't learn from falsehoods. You learn how to lie, maybe, but you don't learn how to be honest, to be telling the truth, to be presenting reality. You don't do anything with it. So this idea that they're just emphasizing the teaching behind that, but the point is, it's not that it's been taken as true history. That is so groundless. I don't even know how to explain that's groundless. When Paul talked about the resurrection, he didn't just say, "Hey, it's okay just to believe in the resurrection, even if the resurrection didn't happen." No, what he argued was that if the resurrection did not happen, then he says your faith is useless. He said that we are found false witnesses because we testify that Jesus is raised from the dead, and you are still found in your sins. You're still sinners, or you still sin. We are still sinners, but You still are yet in your sins, he says. Well, okay, that means that Paul is saying that unless the resurrection is grounded in reality, all of these things would be false. My faith wouldn't be useless. It'd be pointless. I mean, he actually used the word, the King James says in vain. Some translation might say all for naught. It's pointless. It's useless. It's a useless faith if Jesus did not rise again from the dead. And on top of that, Paul said we are found false witnesses, because guess what? We testify that Jesus rose again from the dead, that they had witnessed his resurrection. This idea of trying to assume that the emphasis is on what's being taught, but it didn't really matter to them what was historically true. That's not true. It mattered to them what was historically true. Paul or Jesus often, or John often emphasized Jesus' death by crucifixion as dying for our sins, because Gospel John is very theologically oriented, and so you have this thick, rich theology being taught in the Gospel of John. That's why, in 2nd century, the Gospel of John was the most copied of the 4 Gospels. Everybody loved Gospel of John because it was a very theologically rich gospel. But the theology that Jesus died for our sins is grounded in the reality of Jesus' death by crucifixion. If his crucifixion didn't happen, if it was just, imaginary, which, by the way, Ehrman does accept that Jesus died by crucifixion, by the way. But if it was imaginary, then John's statement about Jesus dying for our sins and the sins of the world would be meaningless. It'd be a groundless statement. So no, this idea that they were trying to emphasize what's being taught, but they did not care about real history. It's a very atheistic thing to say, obviously, because I have heard other atheists say that, but it's false. It is so bogus and so historically demonstrably false that to call it false is an understatement. You can't ground truth. You can't ground what's being taught and what's and theological truths and things like that in false realities. It doesn't work. Jesus grounded marriage, and this also is another piece of evidence here. Jesus grounded marriage in the real institution of marriage by God, of creating man and woman, and that they would become one flesh. In fact, Jesus combines what was in chapter 1 and chapter 2 to show you that this is the same event that's being talked about, that this is the same Adam and Eve in both cases. And Jesus does that and references that, and he says this was from the beginning. Was how God instituted marriage, and he grounded marriage in in Genesis 1 and 2 in reference to Adam and Eve, and God's original institution of marriage. He grounded it that way. He rooted it in it. Why would he do that if they just didn't care? They just didn't care about truth. They didn't care about history. They just, it's all about what's being taught. Jesus is making a point, and the point is grounded in something that never happened. It makes no sense. It is logical absurdity. That's what it is.
Right.
When people start trying to insist on its scientific value, it's like they're missing the point.
Right.
Okay. This is, I don't know if this is a straw man or not. I'm not exactly sure what he means by scientific value. If you're saying, okay, we say that the Bible is not a science book. It's not a science textbook. We don't claim otherwise. Nobody claims otherwise. It's a book of history. It tells of the history of God's dealings with his people, and it's a soteriological history, essentially, going all the way back from creation all the way up to the consummation of all things. All the way to the consummation of all things. And so that's what we think Scripture is. But because the Bible is the inspired, inerrant Word of God, we say that when it touches on science, that means it touches on some kind of fact that we can verify through the scientific method that it winds up being true, and which is true. Oh, by the way, the earliest scientists, all the major, or most of the major branches of physics or sciences that exist today, with the exception of very few, most of them, the vast majority of them, were founded by Christians. Bart knows this. Bart knows it. He alludes to it and talks about it a little bit in his debate, his 7-hour debate with Mike Licona on the resurrection of Jesus, which I have a debate review on my channel if you want to watch that debate review. So he kind of alludes to some of this, and I talk about it in that debate review as well. So, but but all they were scientists. Sir Francis Bacon, that founded the scientific method, was a Christian. And Bart mentioned that in that debate as well. So he knows this. So this idea that somehow that people are missing the scientific value is just false. Because the reality is that science is predicated on the biblical Christian worldview. It is actually based. And so science would not exist apart from the biblical Christian worldview. If biblical Christian worldview didn't exist, science would have no justification, a rational justification for anything that it claims, like in case of assuming patterns in nature in a typical order and that sort of thing. You wouldn't have that. So, absolutely. But anyway, as far as scientific value, if he's saying that we're trying to interpret the Bible in light of science, no, that might be what they're trying to do, but no, that's not what we're trying to do. We're not trying to do that because we think the secular scientists are wrong about that. Plus, in a direct sense, you can't use the scientific method on the past event because it doesn't work on the past event anyhow. And so this, if you concerning things like creation, origin of man, things like that, even evolutionary claims, that deals with a past event. As a result, it would be outside the purview of empirical science anyhow. But in the in-game case, we would still sit there and say that touching on these subject matters, obviously, if it touches on science, it's accurate, and I haven't seen anything at all that shows otherwise, and nothing that Bart said today has. I think the most he said was he hasn't really even talked about evolution, really, despite the fact that that's one of the main things that Erika cares about. But when it comes to, like, I think he said something. He does say the plants, like on day 3, he said they couldn't survive one day without the sun. Obviously, that's false. We have indoor plants. They just need a UV light source, and we know light was created on day 1. Most likely, this was, we can't really determine the nature of the light, but most likely the light would have been the same as what we would receive from the sun. Besides, it'd be inaccurate to say that plants can last longer than one day without the sun. So that's false anyhow. And references. I don't even know. Did he mention anything else about science? I'm trying to think. I thought maybe he mentioned other things, but he hasn't really. So I don't see why he thinks. I think the allusion here is probably to things like what secularists believe on the age of the earth and evolution and that sort of thing. But that's not really based on science. That's based on certain assumptions such as uniformitarianism and things like that. But he hasn't really referenced it yet, directly at least. But there's nothing I've seen in the Bible that contradicts known verifiable science. Verifiable, not, secular views or secular assumptions or something like that. But I'm talking about verifiable science where we can prove in a definitive sort of way with the scientific method.
Right. Yeah, that strikes me as pretty par for the course, really, for all of the Old Testament and really a lot of the New Testament as well. And, it's presenting this story, right? And there may be, in many cases, some kind of historical grounding to it, at least in experience, right? It felt that way to the people at the time.
Yeah.
But not necessarily, like, you're right. It doesn't seem to be that much of an issue, at least from a plain reading, that it was meant to be so literalist.
All right. To start with, all of them, if it's okay, it's going to be based on the type of literature. When we use the word literal, we're talking about according to its literature. Okay, and over half of the Old Testament, over half of it, roughly, is historical narrative. Okay, that means it's understood and being interpreted in light of presenting history. Now, Erika seems to be willing to concede to the possibility that the people at the time accepted that this is representing real history. And but she then goes back on that and tries to claim, well, I can understand why they would not see it so literalistically, and she used the air quotes. And the reality is that that's actually kind of contradicts itself. How could they present it as if it's real history and understand it as history, but then go back and say, well, they didn't really represent it as history? Yes, they did. If it's historical narrative, now it would just depend on the type of literature it is, but if it's historical narrative, they would have understood it as representing real history. When you read a biography, do you assume automatically that the biography is false? Even if the biography has some factual errors in it, you still are going to assume it's true unless you have other reasons to think otherwise. And you're going to assume, and at the very least, regardless, even if you found some factual errors in it, you're going to still say, well, the person's obviously representing this as true history, but, made some mistakes along the lines. And that sort of thing. You would say stuff like that. You wouldn't say that, oh, well, they didn't understand this as history, even though they're presenting it as history. That's an oxymoron. That's a self-contradictory claim. It doesn't work. So certainly that they understood it as historical, and it is intended to be understood historical. Now again, they haven't really brought up literary genres anywhere in this discussion. That's the interesting part. They have not brought up literary genres anywhere in this discussion. You think that they would, right? After all, that's what it's going to be over, is what kind of literature it's as being written there. But I don't think that either of them understands exegesis, interpretation, and that sort of thing. I think Bart does understand literary genres, because he knows that the Gospels, for example, is Greco-Roman biographies, and he does accept the Gospels as Greco-Roman biographies. But this idea that suddenly, or at least the idea that Erika's proposing, it's really, really twisted. It's just not the way you interpret historical literature. And you're supposed to understand it as literal. You're supposed to understand it as historical. And that's just a fact. That's just the way you understand literature. If you read a newspaper today, do you read it thinking you're reading Harry Potter, or do you think you're reading actual news, what actually happened? Do you believe that they're checking their facts and that sort of thing? And in the same like manner, if you're reading the newspaper and you come across a comic strip, do you assume that the comic strip is the same as the article that talks about a shooting at a school or something? No, of course not. When you read Harry Potter, do you automatically assume Harry Potter is the same as reading a newspaper? No, of course not. Because you take into account the kind of literature you are reading. And you are understanding how to understand and how to interpret the passages in question is going to depend on a number of factors, such as context, literary genre, a relative passage, other passages in other similar contexts. And we kind of do these kinds of thinking in our exegesis of any type of literature, whether we're reading ancient literature, whether we're reading modern literature. We're doing this constantly, looking at the context, taking into account literary genre. Are we reading a biography? Are we reading a poem? Are we reading, is there metaphors in there, in the context to indicate that? Is there hyperbolic language? We're taking all that into account as we're reading it. And we're factoring in context and things like that. That's how communication happens. That's how all communication happens. How do you know what I'm saying is understood as literal? How do you know that? Because the fact is that you got contacts, you got what I'm saying. The video, for example, is intended to be understood educationally, so I'm presenting this actual truth. Even if you think I'm making mistakes, I'm still presenting it as truth as a result. In which case, this video is not intended to be entertainment. There's videos on YouTube that's intended to be entertainment. It's something that I had to teach my son early on because he grew up in an age of internet, age of computers. He has his own computer. He's had several computers now, and he sits there and watches things on YouTube and stuff like that. And I had to basically address that with him. And I had to constantly tell him that it wasn't true, because he used to take entertaining videos as if they were actual stuff that was actually happening and things like that. And I had to explain to him that they intended the video as entertainment purposes. It's not intended to be truth. And I'm not saying, and then I had to sit there and explain, I'm not saying that nothing on YouTube is true. I'm not saying that nothing on the internet is true. But not everything on the internet is true. That's the point. And I had to constantly drill that into him for him to understand that. In any given case, but the point is that we take, as human beings, we take that into an assessment. Of course, my son is a child. He's only 13 years old, so you expect that from him. But as adults, we're expected to be rational and come up with rational arguments and utilize things like common sense, and we have life experiences behind us. It's just a normal way we read literature, always. We take that into account. If I'm reading a newspaper, I'm not going to read it the same way as if I'm reading National Enquirer, which is a gossip rag, that sort of thing. I'm not going to read them the same way. And so if I'm reading Genesis, the book of Genesis, which is intended historical narrative, I'm going to understand it as history, as at least as it's the writer's presenting it as history. And then we could talk about whether you think certain things it's saying is true or not true. But it is being understood historically. Now, Bart looks like he's about ready to address something that she said. So I'm going to go ahead and play that.
Yeah, and I think that, I'm actually a historian by nature. I didn't know what really happened. And so I am very interested in what really happened. And I think, you can say a lot more about the New Testament than the Old Testament. Because, look at Genesis. You're talking about people writing down stories centuries after they allegedly occurred. We're not talking about 40 or 50 years the way you are with the New Testament gospel. You're talking about centuries and centuries.
All right. Okay, for start with, just to kind of clarify, he does present himself and calls himself a historian. He has no actual academic credentials as a historian, so he's not a professional historian. So he's not trained at the academic level in historical methodology. So he gets his historical methods from critical scholars and critical historians and things like that. And he assumes that represents mainstream historical methodology, and it doesn't. He often encounters fiction because of that. But in given case, he seems to be saying, okay, I understand what you're saying, but I agree that the New Testament, you could say a lot more about New Testament than you can the Old Testament, and that's what he's trying to argue there. So he seems to show a slight difference and disagreement with what Erika's saying here, because Erika seems to say, well, you can't really know much about the New Testament either, and he's like, no, you actually can. So Bart is actually admitting that. But with the Old Testament, he's trying to say that these things are centuries later and that sort of thing. Actually, the Genesis one thing is closer. It really will just depend on well, I guess if you take a younger view, maybe that. But you have Genesis is based on earlier written sources. They go all the way back, in some cases, even all the way back to Adam. Like, for example, when it says in Genesis 5, I think it says this generation of Adam and Eve. So the word generation there is actually record. The Hebrew word there is toledoth. The literal translation of toledoth is record. This is a literary record. That means we have records that's found within the Genesis account that goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. I reject this evolutionary thinking that they didn't know how to read and write and that sort of thing. I think that they did know how to read and write. But I think that they did have learn how to read and write. I reject this evolutionary time scale where people didn't know how to read and write and communicate and that sort of thing. I think they did know how to communicate. You see Adam and Eve communicating in the Garden of Eden and that sort of thing. But in any given case, we have literary records going all the way back to that time period. We got a record of Adam, for example, that goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. And so I don't agree with that idea that these things are centuries later. I think that they're based on early records, and we see that also throughout the Old Testament. They'll refer to things that are even earlier. In the case of the Babylonian event, the destruction of Jerusalem, that actually some of these writings happened during the time that these events were happening. When Jeremiah was watching the whole city of Jerusalem get destroyed in the Book of Lamentations, he's watching these events take place. And you got Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Daniel, all contemporaries of each other, writing about the same event. And we see these events also recorded in the Babylonian Chronicles, which was found by archaeologists, inscriptions that would date back to the time of the event that matches the Bible's description. And apparently, most scholars, including Bart, would be willing to accept that this event took place in 567, 68 BC. And so would accept that this event actually took place. And the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Jews were exiled to Babylon, and all matching the description that the Bible gave. Then you got books that are post-exilic, like Nehemiah and Ezra, and that sort of thing, that actually talk about the exile that the Jews went through. You got Daniel, portions of Daniel that took place after the exile, and Daniel's talking about him along with others being exiled to Babylon. And so you have that in the book of Daniel. And so this idea that these things are written centuries later is just not true. In fact, they actually are written contemporaneous with the events, which is much different than the Gospels, because the Gospels are written like 30, 40 years later, but that's not really a big deal as far as memory. Bart makes a big deal out of that, but there's not really a big deal over it. There's things that happened 30, 40 years ago that I remember. Right now, I am 45 years old, and I could still remember things 30 years ago. I can still remember it. 30 years ago, I was a 15-year-old kid. I still remember things when I was 15. I remember situations I went through, problems, issues, times when I got angry and things like that. I still remember that, and I remember every single detail of it. This idea that somehow that people are just gonna forget about things like Jesus' death by crucifixion, his resurrection, details about things that he taught them. Disciples often linger on whatever it is that their master talked about. I mean, they literally had to learn it. In fact, the word disciple, it comes from Latin, I think, means disciplined one, essentially. And back in those days, a disciple was no different. There's someone that really trained themselves to understand. They mimic their master's teachings. They mimic their master's behavior. Their what they did. Their examples of their moral examples and things like that. They mimicked those things, and they became almost like smaller versions of Jesus, that sort of thing, because they were mimicking everything that their master said, everything their master taught them, everything their master did. And these things would have often been repeated over and over and over again, because that's the nature of old cultures, is repetition and so forth. We'll probably get into a little bit of old cultures because he's about to touch on that, I think. But in any given case, all right, let's continue.
So the likelihood of having something historical, and people say, well, back then they had oral tradition, they kept it all accurate. Yeah.
anyone who's ever played a game of telephone knows that doesn't tend to work out well.
All right, this is a gross misrepresentation of old culture when someone tries to make a contrast between telephone game. The telephone game is like when you kind of like in a chain of individuals, you whisper in each other's ear, and the fun of the game is to see someone get it wrong at the end. So someone saying, "You are my best friend," and it might come out to "You are a beastly fiend" by the time it gets to the end. And so the fun of the game is to try to get someone to get it wrong. So you whisper in someone's ear, you do it in an inaudible whisper. You're not allowed to repeat it, and you do this in a chain of individuals. Is this how oral cultures were done? No, not by a long shot. Oral cultures are done in a clear, loud voice. They are allowed to repeat it. In fact, they do repeat it. Repetition was a huge part of oral tradition. A scholar by the name, I got a book right here, a scholar by the name of Birger Gerhardsen wrote a book called Memory and Manuscript, which he researched second century rabbis and the pattern that they had on oral tradition, and repetition was one of the biggest things that was emphasized in that. Repetition often solidifies the information to your mind. In fact, that's how we typically learn things today, is we a lot of times we repeat them over and over again until we actually remember them, because repetition solidifies it. And repetition was a big emphasis back then on oral tradition. You also have entire communities saying these things over and over again. So it's not just being done by one person or one or two people. You've got like a whole community of people doing it. And so you got this self-correcting nature within the oral tradition and so forth. I've actually responded to Bart Ehrman on oral tradition. But this also is kind of a straw man. We don't claim that Genesis is based on oral tradition. Now, they might be claiming that, but we don't claim that. Whether instead we believe that the Genesis is the original count. There were written records involved. Now, if you want to, I don't think we would consider God telling Moses how he did it as oral tradition. But anyway, but God is the ultimate eyewitness behind that and does communicate this information to Moses. And so I do think that this event actually took place, and that God is the ultimate eyewitness to it. There's divine revelation involved, but there's also written literary sources that Genesis is based on. But I think Genesis is the original account of the events. And now we do believe that these other stories, like the Enuma Elish and so forth, were based on oral tradition. They got spread around as a result of the Babylonian captivity. Now, you could argue that the Genesis count possibly could have been spread around as well, but that's probably why it wound up getting distorted in various cultures and so forth. But Genesis itself, what's relating in the Genesis, is the original account. It's the most sober account of these events. We don't see, like, for example, when you see Noah's Ark being created, it not only gives very precise dimensions, really good dimensions, but it also talks about the pitch that was added on the inside and outside of the boat, which appears to be some kind of waterproofing agent, which seems to be an irrelevant detail to add if you're just telling a story that's false. And you don't see that at all in like the Epic of Gilgamesh. They don't mention the pitch at all. But in the story of Genesis, you see the pitch being added on the inside and the outside, obviously with an intent to waterproof this boat and make it seaworthy. And so you get the feel that this is the original, more sober account of what actually took place. And so I don't think that it would follow that this is based on some kind of oral cultural account. There's no evidence of that at all. But let's say that it was. Jewish oral traditions were so heavily embedded they were extremely accurate. This is something that Gerhardsen figured out as well, that these traditions were extremely accurate. I have done my own personal studies on oral traditions. There's been oral cultural studies that have been done that show how accurate they are, and there are others that disagree with this. There are form critics. It's mostly form critics that really claims this. this culture was not a uncontrolled oral culture. It was a controlled oral culture. So this information was being controlled, very much so, by external agents. In this case, it could be controlled by an entire community of people. It could be controlled by individuals, and there's all sorts of ways that could happen. I got a whole shelf full of books on oral cultural tradition. I responded to Bart Ehrman in my Bart Ehrman series on oral cultural tradition. So if you want to catch that in my Bart Ehrman series on my channel, I certainly did respond to Bart Ehrman on this and even quoted from actual sources in oral culture tradition. I think Bart's interpretation of oral culture tradition is just incorrect. It's more based on a more highly critical view of oral cultures rather than a more accurate, sober historical account of historic or oral cultures. So this is just inaccurate at all. But the telephone game is just a gross, and I mean a gross misrepresentation of oral cultures. That's not how oral cultures were at all. We start with oral culture was not people sitting there whispering in someone's ear trying to get them to get it wrong. That wasn't oral culture at all. It wasn't a chain of individuals. You have an entire community of people. You're not allowed to repeat it in telephone game, but in oral cultures, you're constantly repeating it. In fact, repetition was the main emphasis in oral cultures, and repetition is a way of solidifying the information into your memory. That's how we learn things today, is we consistently repeat things. So this is just inaccurate. And I've done entire studies on oral culture. I've got a whole shelf filled with books on it that's double stacked because I got them all on one shelf. But there's lots and lots of books on that. My research wasn't exhaustive, but it was very extensive. And so I would disagree with Bart on this. I think that the oral tradition was extremely accurate if it's controlled like this. And the Jewish oral tradition was very controlled. In some cases, they were able to pass down information verbatim, even. So no, I would disagree with that exactly on oral tradition. All right, let's continue.
And you do it over centuries, and you start changing the languages in different cultures and different.
Yeah.
Oh my God! Yeah, and things change.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, I wonder if they realize that the Old Testament, though, is not changing language. I mean, you got there's only two different language in the Old Testament. You got Hebrew and you got Aramaic. Aramaic only has certain portions of Aramaic, and it's very it's a very similar Semitic language to Hebrew. And in fact, like Hebrew, it is a Semitic language, and it's very similar to Hebrew, actually. I've never actually studied Aramaic. I studied Hebrew, but my understanding is that Hebrew and Aramaic are very similar to each other. There's only portions of it that's even Aramaic, but in the Old Testament, most of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. And so you don't have switching of languages like that. Anyhow,
I hadn't been considered the linguistic shifts that would have to occur. I mean, even local dialects are gonna skew the meaning of something. We have that in English, of all things, today. Contemporaneous languages have.
Well, it's really hard with Genesis. You were saying like it's hard to interpret a culture, but the problem with the Hebrew Bible is that it's the only Hebrew literature from that period.
Really?
English. If you write something in English and somebody doesn't know what a word means, they can just see how the word is used in 100 other writers. And the same with Greek and Latin and other Hebrew from that period, like in the 8th century, the 10th century. We don't have other stuff to compare it.
All right. Essentially, Bart is arguing that that we don't have other things from that period to compare to the Old Testament, so therefore we don't know. The assumption is we don't know how to fully understand how they understood words and how they understood the language at the time. This is false. I mean, it's false for the reason that we can't understand it. But the Old Testament is not one source, is it? No, it's 39 sources. Let's assume he's right. I question whether that's correct or not, but let's say that he's right. That all we have are these 39 books written of the Old Testament of that particular language. Is that enough? Yes, because that leaves us, let's say our evaluation is over Genesis. Well, then we have 38 other works that we could contrast it to, regardless. So it's not, and nobody thinks that the Old Testament is written by one writer. Everyone agrees that it's written by multiple writers, even if they differ on whether they think it's the same authorship that we recognize traditionally, or whether they think it's a different writer, or whether they think the writers are unknown, or that the books are later, or whatever the case may be, whatever skepticism that they're trying to apply to it. But we do know that we do have these other books that we're able to contrast, written by other people, regardless what they think it is, that we're able to make a contrast to, and we're able to know what the language is. But in any case, we do know how to read and translate Hebrew. I don't know why he's saying that. It sounds like he's trying to question whether we can even understand Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, as it is in the Old Testament. He's probably taken Hebrew courses during the course of his college career and stuff like that, especially since I know he's trained in Greek at the very least. So, I don't understand where this is coming from. He knows we know how to translate Hebrew, including the Hebrew of the Old Testament. So this just doesn't make any sense. He sounds like he's trying to bring into question whether we can fully understand what is being meant there within the Old Testament in terms of course, this has to do with translation, not interpretation. Now, they are related in one sense, because the same rules of exegesis that you would use for interpretation, you also use for translation. And obviously, translation does impact interpretation, because how you translate it will depend on how you interpret it, and that's probably what he's trying to get at. The problem, however, is that we actually know how to translate the Hebrew Old Testament. Even if we had nothing else except these 39 books, and I'm assuming he's being truthful with that. I'm assuming that that still gives us, like if our evaluations on Genesis, we still have 38 books we can compare it to, regardless. They're written by other people, other writers. So yeah, we still have ways of being able to assess Hebrew and so forth. And we know how to translate Hebrew. Why do you think Old Testament scholars are able to translate Hebrew? I don't think any Old Testament scholar or Hebrew scholar would agree with what he's saying here. They may agree that maybe they will agree that we don't have any. I don't know if they would. I've never checked it out before. So I don't know whether that's true or not. But I'm saying, I'm taking it for granted, assuming it's true, okay? We would still have 39 sources that talk about the Hebrew and put it in a particular context, and they refer to the same events back to the same events. You got Exodus 20:11 that refers back to Genesis 1, and things like that, and we have that. And so we know how these things are supposed to be translated. In addition to that, much of the Old Testament is re-quoted by the apostles from the Greek Septuagint. Now, try to understand this. Most of the Bible quotes from the Old Testament are being quoted by these guys, these apostles, from the Greek Septuagint, which translated during the intertestamental period, translated the Old Testament into Greek. And so they had that, and they are quoting the Septuagint. And we can contrast what they say here in Greek, and we know Greek, and Bart would definitely agree that we have other Greek sources, some of which are even contemporaneous to the writings of the New Testament, and he would admit that. And so we know this in Greek, and this Greek text translates from the Septuagint, which also quotes the same Hebrew Bible. So we are familiar with how to translate it and how to understand it and things like that. So this act of trying to question, to throw a wedge of doubt into whether or not if we can properly translate it to the point where we can interpret it properly, is just desperation. It's just reaching. It's really stretching the envelope here of what is even plausible. So this is just I don't know of any Old Testament scholar or any Hebrew scholar that would agree with this. It's just stretches everything. Now that doesn't mean that we might not hold some difficulty, but a few difficult passages, or a few difficulty in understanding a certain word or a nuance or something, and then trying to stretch that to mean that we can't understand anything in the Old Testament. It's really extreme. I mean, really extreme. To call it extreme is an understatement. That's a very extreme claim. And I don't think anybody, not even critical scholars, I don't think that they would take this position either. It is just, it's terrible. And besides, again, talking about Bart Ehrman's inconsistency, would he ever consistently hold to that view? No. He would probably quote from the Old Testament. He'd probably talk about what the text says, etc. Why would he contrast what he thinks is true of Genesis to ancient Near Eastern literature when we don't even know if Genesis really should be translated that way? He obviously would never take this kind of argument consistently. It'd just be impossible to take consistently and do what he does, So I don't understand why Bart wouldn't be making this argument. I can see why Erika would want to take to it. I mean, she's a skeptic, and she's even more critical and skeptical of the New Testament and the Old Testament than even Bart is. So I can see why Erika would want to do that. But Bart, he should know better than make an argument like this, but he does it anyhow. He can't consistently live up to it. It'd be impossible to live up to. Ultimately, he would have to concede to the translation of the Old Testament, and it's agreed universally across the bar. Now that doesn't mean there won't be a difficult word or something that might be translation of it might be disputed or something, but that wouldn't automatically equate to just throwing out the whole Old Testament as a result. Throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as they say.
In their place, we don't know what the word means.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it looks like it's an animal with 4 legs. Other than that, I don't know. Is it an aardvark? I don't know.
Yeah. They're like, oh yeah, the beasts of the field, right? It's like livestock kind of maybe.
All right. Bart, again, the fact, even if we don't know what a word means fully, this does not equate to us throwing out the whole Old Testament. Bart's known for wanting to throw out the baby with the bathwater, as they say. He's known for that. He's ready to just act like he's ready to give up on all of it if there's even one thing that he can't understand or can't grasp his mind around or something like that. And that's just not the case. And what was that beast of the field thing? It's obvious what the beast of the field is referring to. It's a very broad category that refers to animals, and it could be livestock maybe. I have to look it up some more, but it's obviously a broad category, and it's pretty obvious though, that it's talking about some kind of land animal, obviously. But she's acting like that's an example of what Bart's talking about here, but it's not. What Bart's talking about is the difficulty in translating certain words into English because we're not fully, their meanings might be disputed or we might not fully understand what is being said there. Beast of the field is referring to a term relating to something, and so Erika's saying, well, I don't really understand what that means to call something a beast of the field, so therefore that matches what Bart's talking about. No, that has to do with her own ignorance, not on how a particular verse is supposed to be translated based on a limited knowledge of Hebrew or anything like that. But in any given case, beasts of the field, it's pretty obvious that it is land animals. So this doesn't even fit what Bart is talking about here. Let's continue.
Sometimes things of that nature. That's very interesting. Just generally speaking, because I hadn't considered that, the fact that it's like there are entire sections that are kind of, our translation was created using context clues. It almost seems, which is
but they're passive.
Wow. context clues. Okay, try to understand something. Okay, now Bart should have corrected her at this point, because he does know how to translate things. I've translated things. I don't think Erika's ever translated anything a day in their life. But just to kind of point out the obvious, okay, a lot of the rules of exegesis is actually used in translating. The same rules that we use to interpret scripture is also the same rules that we use to translate it. Well, one of the main things, actually the main thing to look at in translating something is actually the same main thing to look at when doing exegesis, namely context. And that's true of every situation in which you're translating a text, because context is key. It's what determines how to translate a particular passage, is the context. It's the difference between translating Dorea as freely given, like in Romans 3, I think verse 5, where it says that we're saved by God's grace through the redemption that's freely given us through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. Paraphrasing some of that, but the word freely given or freely is Dorea, but the same Greek word is also used in Galatians 2:21, when it says, "If righteousness be by the law, then Christ is dead for nothing." For nothing, or all for naught, it is, or in like in the King James, is translated in vain, pointless, fruitless, futile, however you want to say that, is the same Greek word, Dorea. Then how do you know which meaning is in view? Because of context. And that's true of any type of translating. No matter what, we're looking at context. Clearly, Erika has never translated anything a day in her life. If she did, she would know that. She seems to be saying that like, we wouldn't know this unless we have context. Well, of course. How would we know anything? And by the way, even if we were not dealing with a translational issue, if we're just dealing with a literary issue, if we're just looking at the text itself, like in English, like someone writes me an English written letter, I'm still going to be doing the same thing. I'm still going to be looking at context, no matter what. Whether I'm translating something or I'm viewing it, just reading a piece of literature or something, I'm still going to be looking at context. Context is always the main thing. Always. Of course, when you're translating, there is the reason why you have to use the same rules of exegesis, same rules of interpretation, because translating is actually an interpretive process. It doesn't mean it's subjective. Obviously, there's an objective, just like interpretation in the biblical sense is referring to, or in the sense of literature, is always objective, because we're trying to figure out what the original writer meant. So that's always objective when it is used in a literary sense like this, because the original writer had an original meaning and intent when he wrote what they wrote. So it's used objectively. So it is used objectively from a translational standpoint as well. But it's always interpretive, because we have to understand what they are saying. So as a result, we are going to use the same rules of interpretation that we normally would use if we weren't translating it, but just reading it ourselves, reading the piece of literature ourselves. So context is the main thing, and she acts like well, we can't know what it is unless we have context clues. Well, how would you know anything? How would you be able to know anything from any kind of literature, whether it's something we're translating or whether it's something we're just simply interpreting? How would you know anything that we're looking at? Context. That's how you know.
They're very hard to translate, both because of the grammar and because of the vocabulary.
Yeah.
And we don't. It's such. I go into all this in my course because it's also, when these things were written, when our manuscripts of these things are the entire book of Genesis is basically based on the manuscript that was produced around the year 1000 of the Common Era.
Okay, he's probably talking about the Leningrad Codex. The Leningrad Codex is roughly around 1100, roughly around by 1100 AD. It was invented by the Mosaic scribes, and it is 1,000 years after the time of Christ. Now, a full-blown book of Genesis is in the Leningrad Codex. But now, the way Bart says this, though, is very deceptive. It's very misleading. It makes you think that there's no way we have to check whether or not the veracity of the Old Testament text, as if we have no way of knowing how accurate these copies were. That's false. We actually do. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls that were compiled together by or before AD 70, and they go all the way back to even before the Common Era. And there's even fragments of Genesis in it, but we can actually determine that and use that to determine how accurate they were. Within the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a complete copy of Isaiah called the Great Isaiah Scroll. It's also known as Isaiah A, and it's a complete copy of it. And over 95% of it was found an agreement with our earliest copy of Isaiah from the Leningrad Codex, which is dated to about 1,000-year difference. So 1,000 years of copying, and there was hardly much change in wording and hardly any change in meaning, or no change in meaning. And we know this. We actually have that. And we have a way of knowing that and of course we knew that the scribal process by which they preserved the text. I would love to tell you it's not Bible worshiping, but it was not. It was, if it wasn't Bible worship, it was short of it, because they really revered the Bible. They revered it. They respected it. They put it on a pedestal. They were very meticulous. And the reason why we can't find any manuscripts before our discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls as far as the Hebrew, is because the Mosaic scribes would burn any manuscripts that had even one error in it. That's how big they were on truthfulness. But we had no way of checking that, short of, which is another thing, Sumerian Pentateuch and the early version of the Septuagint. Okay, the Septuagint was the Greek text of the Old Testament that was translated during the intertestamental period before the Common Era. Our earliest manuscript of the Septuagint comes to the 3rd century, which is much closer to the time of Christ. And it actually represents the Septuagint that was used in the time of Christ. Most of the quotes from the New Testament are actually from the Greek Septuagint in the Old Testament. Or from the Old Testament quotes. Most of the quotations are from the Greek Septuagint that's in the New Testament, and the Septuagint, the earliest manuscript we have, that represent what the form of the Septuagint was during the time of the apostles, in the time of Jesus, and you could actually look at how substantially in agreement that it is. I mean, there's some differences, but it's and there's some textual issues, but not like, to a point where we don't know what was being said or anything. Hold on for a second, and I will jump straight to the Septuagint just to kind of give you a glimpse of that. Okay, here we are in the Septuagint. You can see the Septuagint, the Genesis 1:1, and over here in the Hebrew, you can see Genesis 1:1. See, and Arche, Epoesan, Hathas, Tan, Huanan, Ka, Tain, Gain. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. All right. Here you see the same thing. Bereshith bara Elohim Eith Hashamayim Va'eth Haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it even follows the wording here in Genesis 1:1. That's the interesting part of this. Now, you won't necessarily have it quite so verbatimly aligned there throughout the Septuagint, but for the most part, substantially, it agrees with the text that we have that's written many centuries after the Septuagint, the earliest manuscript of the Septuagint. And you can see that, and it follows along with the English, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and so forth. So this idea that that this is just that we just have no way of checking the text. That's just false. We do have a way of checking the text. We can check it with the Septuagint. We check it with the Sumerian Pentateuch, an early version of the Sumerian Pentateuch. We also have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is dated 1,000 years before, and we can kind of test the copying process, how accurate it was. Now, it's not quite as sufficient as what we got in the New Testament, but it is pretty good. It's good enough to be able to come up with a pretty accurate reading of what the Old Testament originally said, and that the English translations that we have are indeed accurate. So this idea of trying to make it questionable because we don't have any like a complete work of Genesis or something of that nature prior to the Leningrad Codex is just it's really misleading. We have ways of checking the text. We have ways of checking the copying process that the Jews used, and we know how accurate it was. We know how spot on it was. We know how good it was, etc. Like I said, it's probably not going to be as efficient as the New Testament, what we got from the New Testament by far, but it is going to be good enough to be able to ascertain theological views and things like that from the text, and pretty much even come up with an overall understanding what the wording, or at least close to the wording of the Old Testament was. So I don't agree with this at all, what Bart is saying here. Well, that was some discussion. I had more to it, but my sound had messed up and I didn't realize it until I started editing the video. Sorry about that, but it's okay. I don't think I'm going to get any more significant substance out of it. I thought about redoing it, but I said no. I just don't think I'm going to get much more out of this conversation. Any given case, it was terrible argumentation. Some laughable results, some usual objections that atheists will throw at, like, oh, well, you have sun 24 hours before, or plants 24 hours before there was a sun, and that sort of thing, and it showed ignorance of botany. Plants can survive longer than 24 hours without the sun. That's a myth that they have to have sun every second or they'll die. They'll eventually die over time, but not 24 hours later, because then you wouldn't be able to account for how plants can survive in the shade during storms, like especially in tropical places with tropical weather and stuff happens a lot frequently, where they might go days, even weeks without the sun, in regions of the world where the sun is not as visible as it is in other parts, where in regions of the world where they might get very little sunlight. And that sort of thing, and so it just didn't work as an argument. There was some taking out of context passages in chapter 2 of Genesis, and not considering the original languages when it comes to the formation of the animals in chapter 2 being based on the previous to man, because it's in pluperfect. It's considered to be pluperfect. That's why it's translated that way in the ESV and so forth. Bart obviously didn't understand the Enuma Elish, because he claimed that Enuma Elish was very similar to Genesis account. It's not. It's very different. You got Tiamat, his corpse being torn in half, one half being created the universe, the other half creating the world. It starts off in another realm prior to the creation of everything. That's not like Genesis account, which starts up in absolute beginning. You got it being started off in chaos, which is usual. Many ancient accounts, they start off in chaos or a state of chaos, whereas Genesis 1 through 3 does the opposite. It goes from a state of good and a perfect creation and then moves to chaos following sin, when disorder and stuff was introduced into the world. And when that happened, then you got disorder, then you got chaos. But you don't have that initially when God created the world and the universe and so forth. And so you have, and of course it's written in poetic style, and which is very different from Genesis 1 through 11, which is written in historical narrative and so forth. So there's lots and lots of differences as a result. So I didn't find the arguments very convincing. Bart Ehrman obviously took the documentary hypothesis argument. I don't agree with that. I think this is pure speculation. It's based on some misconceptions of ancient cultures and things like that, and so and the way they wrote, and it has some non sequiturs, think that, multiple names for God automatically means multiple sources, and it doesn't, and that sort of thing. But there's no actual evidence at all of these 4 extinct documents allegedly existing, let alone being edited by a later editor. There's not a hint of it being done this way in any of the Pentateuch. There's not a hint of it anywhere in the Old Testament. There's not a hint of it in any historical source or archaeological source that we have. There's nothing to indicate this. No inscription, nothing. It is pure speculation. There's no evidence at all for a later date. In fact, there's evidence against the documentary hypothesis and evidence in favor of an earlier date and Mosaic authorship. And so, if this was written post-exilic, we would have expected more Aramaic being put in there. There's no Aramaic in the Pentateuch. But, we would expect Aramaic. Daniel, for example, is written post-exilic as Ezra, and they have portions of it written in Aramaic. So we would expect that from a post-exilic work, but we don't see that anywhere in the Pentateuch. And so there's all kinds of problems with trying to get the late date to try to fit that. There's Egyptian terms and Egyptian language and culture and stuff like that that's in the Pentateuch, indicating that the person in the Pentateuch that wrote the Pentateuch lived and existed in 2nd millennium BCE Egypt. He had to have been physically in Egypt to have known a lot of the stuff that he knew. And this fits perfectly with Moses, but it doesn't fit the idea of some later person, unknown person, post-exilic, post-exile from the Jews were exiled from Babylon. It doesn't fit that at all. So I didn't find the arguments very convincing. It was typical Ehrman MO, throwing out the baby with the bathwater if he sees one word that he does that's hard to translate or understand, and he just wants to toss all of it in the garbage can as a result. Typical Ehrman MO, but these are kinds of extremities scholars can easily recognize and see is fallacious. And so I got my impression from the whole discussion was you got 2 different people here, Erika from Gutsick Gibbon and Bart Ehrman, who have no knowledge of the biblical studies, are not experts in biblical studies or exegesis apparently. They're not experts in the Old Testament or Old Testament studies. You got Bart, who's just a tad bit more familiar with Old Testament studies than Erika, but I don't know what's worse. He just has a little bit of information, enough to make him sound intelligent, even though he's not giving very intelligent arguments, or not being like Erika and not know anything about this stuff. I don't know, but which one's worse? But in any given case, I didn't find it very convincing. I do have a Genesis series out that's currently ongoing, and it's still going, and we're fixing to start chapter 2, and on my next video, I think it'll be in my next video that I'll be starting chapter 2, and I'll do chapter 2 just like I did chapter 1. I'll start it out with an in-depth textual analysis of the text in the Hebrew of Genesis 1, of Genesis and go, or Genesis 2 in this case, and go through that, and I might touch on some stuff that I'm gonna have full blown videos on later, and so forth. And then after I do that, whenever I do other videos after that, I'm gonna kind of go back and do topological stuff, just like I did with Genesis 1. And I can't wait to do that. That's coming soon. Stay tuned for the Genesis series. Chapter 2, if you're not subscribed to my channel, please subscribe, like the videos. Don't forget to hit that notification bell. I have lots more videos coming up, especially in that series. Chapter 2 is going to be my creation versus evolution discussion. I'm going to have some non-creation versus evolution related videos, but in that series as well, or in that chapter as well. But in this chapter, I'm going to be doing a lot of creation versus evolution discussions. So please don't miss that. I know that's a popular discussion. And I'm going to be bringing a lot of experts on here. I want to bring on fossil experts. I want to bring on paleontologists, biologists, geneticists. You know, I want to get some people on here, and we're going to have some very, very interesting discussions. So I've been really looking forward to this chapter. Please, again, subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell. Don't forget to like the video. That kind of helps the YouTube algorithm and gets this information out there. So make sure you hit the like button. Don't forget to do that. I know it's easy to forget that. Watch a video, you really like it, and then you just kind of move on without even thinking about the thumbs up. But remember to give this a thumbs up. It does help YouTube get this information out to more people. The more people like the video, the more YouTube will try to promote it and that sort of thing. Drop me a comment below and tell me what you think, and I will see you on the next one.